Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Marcus Thompson had been working the Riverside Police Department for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything suburban Ohio had to offer. Drug busts in strip mall parking lots, domestic disputes that spilled onto manicured lawns, and the occasional break-in at one of the cookie-cutter houses that lined the streets like dominoes. What he hadn't expected was to spend a Thursday morning staring at security footage that would keep him awake for months to come. The call had come in at 6:47 a.m. from a frantic husband named David Kellerman. His wife, Brittany, had gone to Wilson's Supermart for their weekly grocery run the previous afternoon and never came home. Her 2019 Honda Pilot was found in the parking lot, doors unlocked, purse still sitting in the driver's seat with her wallet, phone, and keys inside. The shopping cart she'd been using was discovered 3 aisles away from the produce section, half filled with items from her carefully written list. What made the whole thing even more unsettling was that Brittany Kellerman was the kind of person who planned everything down to the minute. David had shown Marcus the color-coded family calendar that hung in their kitchen, where every appointment, every soccer practice for their twin daughters, every grocery trip was meticulously scheduled. Tuesday, Emma's dance class. Wednesday, Sophia's piano lesson. Thursday, groceries at Wilson's, 2:30 p.m. sharp. "She's never late," David had said, his voice cracking as he sat in the sterile interview room at the station. "Never. If Brittany says she'll be somewhere at 2:30, she's there at 2:25. When she didn't answer her phone by 4, I knew something was wrong." Marcus had nodded sympathetically, taking notes while his partner, Officer Kyle Morrison, asked the standard questions about recent arguments, financial troubles, any sign that Brittany might have wanted to disappear. But David's answers painted the picture of a woman with absolutely no reason to vanish. They had a solid marriage, healthy finances, 2 daughters who adored their mother, and a social circle that revolved around school functions and neighborhood barbecues. The initial search of the Supermart had yielded nothing. Store employees remembered seeing Brittany, a petite blonde woman in her late 30s with an easy smile, but couldn't recall anything unusual about her behavior. The store manager, a nervous man named Ryan Hutchins, had immediately offered to review the security footage, which is how Marcus found himself in the cramped security office at 9 a.m. the next morning, watching grainy black and white images flicker across multiple monitors. "This is her coming in," Ryan said, pointing to timestamp 2:28 p.m. on monitor 3. "Parking lot camera shows her getting out of the Honda Pilot, grabbing a cart from the corral." Marcus watched as Brittany Kellerman walked through the automatic doors, her movements casual and relaxed. She wore dark jeans, a light blue sweater, and carried a small purse slung over her shoulder. Everything about her demeanor suggested a routine shopping trip. No signs of distress, no indication she was being followed or watched. "She starts in produce like always," Ryan continued, switching to monitor 7. "Apples, bananas, some lettuce. Takes her time, checks everything carefully. Real methodical shopper, you know." The footage showed Brittany moving systematically through the produce section, occasionally consulting a piece of paper, presumably her shopping list. She selected items with the same care she probably used for everything in her organized life, turning apples to check for bruises, giving bunches of bananas a gentle squeeze. "This is where it gets weird," Ryan said, his voice dropping as he switched to monitor 4. "Cereal aisle, 3:17 p.m. Marcus leaned forward, studying the screen intently. Brittany was pushing her cart down the cereal aisle, moving at her usual measured pace. She stopped in front of the breakfast cereals, reached for a box of something on a higher shelf. Then she froze. "Right there," Ryan whispered. "You see it?" Brittany's entire body had gone rigid. The box of cereal slipped from her hand and fell to the floor, but she didn't bend to pick it up. Instead, she stood perfectly still for several seconds, staring at something off camera. Her head turned slowly toward the end of the aisle, and even on the grainy black and white footage, Marcus could see the change in her posture. Where moments before she had appeared relaxed and focused on her shopping, now she looked alert, almost predatory. "What's she looking at?" Marcus asked. "That's just it," Ryan replied. "There's a blind spot at the end of that aisle. Old camera placement, never got around to fixing it. Could be nothing. Could be someone standing there." The footage continued. Brittany abandoned her cart in the middle of the aisle and walked toward the blind spot, her movements suddenly purposeful. She disappeared from view for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. And then this. When Brittany reappeared on camera, she was a different person. Her hair was slightly mussed, her sweater pulled askew. Most disturbing was her face. What Marcus could make out of it looked blank, emotionless. She walked past her abandoned shopping cart without a glance and headed straight for the store's rear exit, the one that led directly to the employee parking area. "She doesn't go back to her car," Ryan explained. "Doesn't finish shopping, doesn't even seem to remember why she was here. Just walks out that back door and..." He shrugged helplessly. "Where does that exit lead?" "Employee lot, like I said, but also to the service road that runs behind the strip mall. If someone was waiting back there..." Marcus felt the familiar chill that came with realizing a case was going to be more complicated than it first appeared. Missing person cases usually fell into predictable categories: runaway spouses, teenagers acting out, elderly people with dementia. But Brittany Kellerman didn't fit any of those profiles, and the security footage raised more questions than it answered. "I need copies of all this footage," Marcus said. "Everything from when she arrived until she left, and I want to talk to everyone who was working that day." "Already pulled it for you," Ryan said, handing over a flash drive. "But about talking to the employees, that might be a problem." "Why?" "The kid who was stocking the cereal aisle when this happened, Austin Blake, 17 years old, works part-time after school. He called in sick yesterday and today. Nobody's been able to reach him." Marcus felt that chill deepen. In his 12 years of police work, he'd learned that coincidences were rarely coincidental. A woman disappears under mysterious circumstances, and the only potential witness suddenly becomes unavailable? That was the kind of detail that transformed a missing person case into something much darker. "I need Austin Blake's address," Marcus said. 20 minutes later, Marcus and Kyle were standing on the front porch of a modest 2-story house in one of Riverside's older neighborhoods. The lawn needed cutting, and newspapers were piling up by the front door. Never a good sign in a town where most people prided themselves on curb appeal. Mrs. Blake answered the door, looking exhausted and worried. She was a thin woman in her 40s with graying brown hair and dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Officers? Is this about Austin? Because I've been calling the school, calling his friends, and nobody's seen him since Tuesday." Marcus and Kyle exchanged glances. Austin Blake hadn't just missed work. He'd disappeared entirely, vanishing the day before Brittany Kellerman went to the supermart. "Mrs. Blake, when did you last see your son?" "Tuesday morning before school. He seemed, distracted? Like something was bothering him. But you know teenagers, they don't talk to their parents about everything." Her voice wavered. "He came home that afternoon, went straight to his room. I called him for dinner, but he said he wasn't hungry. When I went to check on him later, he was gone. Window was open, and some of his clothes were missing." "Had he been acting differently lately? Any changes in behavior? New friends? Anything unusual?" Mrs. Blake nodded slowly. "The past few months, he'd been different, secretive. He got a new phone, Said he'd saved up money from the supermart job to buy it. But Austin's never been good with money, you know? And this phone was expensive. One of those fancy ones. Kyle was taking notes while Marcus continued the questioning. Did Austin ever mention any of the customers at the supermart? Anyone who might have made him uncomfortable or asked about his schedule? Well, he did mention this one woman who came in every Thursday, said she was always really nice to him, asked about school and his plans after graduation. He seemed to like the attention, honestly. Austin's always been a bit lonely, and this woman seemed to take an interest in him. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Can you describe this woman? Small, blonde, pretty. Austin said she looked like someone's mom but dressed younger than most of the customers. He mentioned she always had this detailed shopping list and knew exactly what she wanted. Mrs. Blake paused. Wait, you don't think she had something to do with Austin's disappearance, do you? Rather than answer directly, Marcus asked for permission to search Austin's room. What they found there painted a disturbing picture of a 17-year-old boy who had been living a double life. Hidden under Austin's mattress was a burner phone, different from the expensive smartphone his mother had mentioned. The phone contained dozens of text messages exchanged with someone identified only as B in the contacts. The messages started innocuous enough. Compliments about Austin's work ethic, questions about his interests and future plans. But as Marcus scrolled through the conversation history, the tone shifted. The messages from B became increasingly personal, probing into Austin's home life, his relationship with his mother, his fears and insecurities. She seemed to instinctively know exactly what a lonely teenage boy needed to hear. She told him he was mature for his age, that she understood him in ways his family and friends never could. She spoke about feeling trapped in her own perfect life, surrounded by people who didn't really see her. Look at this, Kyle said, pointing to a message dated 3 weeks earlier. B. Sometimes I watch you at work and think about how different my life could have been if I'd met someone like you when I was younger. Austin. You shouldn't say stuff like that. You're married. B. Are you going to tell me you've never thought about older women? I see how you look at me when I come through your line. Austin. Maybe, sometimes. B. I've been thinking about you too. More than I should. The conversation continued in that vein, with B gradually escalating the intimate nature of their exchanges while Austin seemed to be fighting his own moral reservations. She was patient, persistent, never pushing too hard too fast. It was a textbook example of grooming behavior, executed by someone who clearly understood exactly how to manipulate a vulnerable teenager. The final series of messages was dated Tuesday afternoon, the day Austin disappeared. B. I can't stop thinking about our conversation, about what you said you wanted. Austin. My mom would kill me if she found out I was talking to you like this. B. That's why it has to be our secret. You said you trusted me. Austin. I do trust you. B. Then meet me tonight. I know a place where we can be alone, where we can talk without worrying about anyone finding out. Austin. I don't know. This feels wrong. B. Nothing about the way I feel about you is wrong. But if you're not ready, if you're still just a kid who needs his mommy's permission. Austin. I'm not a kid. B. Then prove it. Meet me at the storage units on Miller Road at 11 p.m. Building C, Unit 47. And Austin, don't tell anyone where you're going. This has to stay between us. The message thread ended there. Marcus stared at the phone screen, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. Brittany Kellerman, devoted wife and mother, pillar of the suburban community, had been conducting an illicit relationship with a teenage employee at the grocery store where she shopped. She had lured him to an isolated location with promises of a romantic encounter, and then both of them had vanished. But that left the biggest question of all unanswered. What had happened at that storage unit? And if Brittany Kellerman was capable of manipulating and potentially harming a teenage boy, what else might she be capable of? "We need to get to those storage units," Marcus said, already heading for the door. Kyle nodded grimly. "And we need to call in a full forensics team, because I have a feeling we're not looking for 2 missing persons anymore." As they drove toward Miller Road, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Brittany Kellerman's blank, emotionless face on the security footage. Whatever had happened in that blind spot at the supermart, it had transformed a seemingly normal suburban mother into someone or something entirely different. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a question that would haunt him for weeks to come. If Brittany Kellerman could fool her own husband and children about who she really was, how many other people in Riverside were hiding similar secrets behind their perfect suburban facades? The storage facility on Miller Road sat at the edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fence and accessible only through a single gate. It was the kind of place people rented units at when they needed to hide things they couldn't keep at home. Old furniture, seasonal decorations, or in some cases, evidence of crimes they'd rather forget. As Marcus and Kyle pulled into the parking lot, the facility manager was already waiting for them by the main office. Word traveled fast in small towns, and news that the police were interested in one of the units had clearly reached him quickly. "Unit C-47, the manager said without preamble. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with oil-stained fingers and a nervous demeanor. "Been rented for about 3 months now, paid in cash, 6 months up front. Renter gave her name as Beth Kelly." Marcus and Kyle exchanged glances. Beth Kelly, close enough to Brittany Kellerman to be a hastily chosen alias, different enough to avoid immediate detection if someone ran the name. "Can you describe the woman who rented it?" "Small, blonde, real polite. Said she needed somewhere to store some things while she went through a divorce. You know, stuff she didn't want her husband to find during the proceedings. Happens more than you'd think." They followed the manager through a maze of identical storage buildings until they reached Unit C-47. The metal roll-up door was secured with a heavy padlock, and there were no windows or other ways to see inside. "We're going to need bolt cutters," Marcus said. While Kyle went to fetch the necessary tools from their patrol car, Marcus walked the perimeter of the building, looking for any signs of disturbance. The concrete floor of the covered walkway showed faint drag marks leading to and from Unit C-47, and there were what looked like dried blood drops near the base of the door. When Kyle returned with the bolt cutters, Marcus had already called for backup and a full forensics team. Whatever they were about to find inside that storage unit, he had a feeling it was going to require more expertise than 2 patrol officers could provide. The padlock snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the storage facility. Marcus grabbed the door handle and began to roll it up, the metal grinding against its tracks as the contents of Unit C-47 were gradually revealed. What they saw inside would change everything they thought they knew about Brittany Kellerman, Austin Blake, and the dark secrets that could fester beneath the surface of even the most ordinary-seeming lives. But that revelation would have to wait until they could process what their eyes were telling them, because the scene inside Unit C-47 was unlike anything either officer had encountered in their combined 20-plus years of police work. And in that moment, Marcus realized that Brittany Kellerman's disappearance from the supermart wasn't the beginning of their investigation. It was just the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding in the shadows of Riverside for much longer than anyone had imagined. The smell hit them first, a sickly sweet combination of decay and industrial disinfectant that made Kyle gag and step backward. Marcus forced himself to breathe through his mouth as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior of storage Unit C-47, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The unit had been converted into something that resembled a twisted combination of a laboratory and an artist's studio. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, each containing dozens of glass jars filled with clear liquid and floating objects that Marcus didn't want to examine too closely. A fold-out table dominated the center of the space, covered with notebooks, photographs, and what appeared to be detailed anatomical drawings. But it was the far corner that made Marcus reach for his radio to call for immediate backup. Austin Blake was there, or what remained of him. The 17-year-old boy was suspended from the ceiling by a complex system of ropes and pulleys, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had been used for some kind of grotesque experiment. His eyes had been surgically removed, and in their place were small cameras, their red recording lights blinking steadily in the dim light of the storage unit. "Jesus Christ," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus was already on his radio, calling for detectives, forensics, the coroner, and anyone else who might be equipped to process what they'd stumbled into. As he spoke, he forced himself to continue examining the scene, knowing that every detail might be crucial to understanding what had happened here. The notebooks on the table were filled with meticulous handwriting in what appeared to be Brittany Kellerman's neat script. Marcus used a pen to flip through the pages, careful not to contaminate potential evidence. What he read made his blood run cold. Entry 1. Subject acquired successfully. Initial resistance minimal once sedation took effect. Preliminary measurements completed. Subject appears to be in excellent physical condition for the procedure. Entry 7. Subject has adapted well to the restraint system. Vital signs remain stable. Beginning Phase 2 of the observation protocol. The cameras are functioning perfectly. I can now see everything he sees, even in complete darkness. Entry 12. Remarkable discovery. The subject's capacity for terror seems to be limitless. Even after days of conditioning, each new stimulus produces the same intense physiological response. The fear never diminishes. It only transforms. Entry 18. Subject has stopped attempting verbal communication. This is expected at this stage of the process. The cameras continue to function, providing fascinating data about how the human eye responds to various forms of visual trauma. The entries continued for weeks, documenting what appeared to be a systematic torture and psychological experimentation program. Brittany had been using Austin Blake as a test subject for procedures that defied both medical ethics and basic human decency. "Marcus," Kyle called from the far side of the unit. "You need to see this." Kyle was standing in front of a second table that had been hidden behind a portable screen. This table held dozens of photographs, all carefully organized in manila folders, labeled with dates going back over 3 years. The photos showed other victims, men and women of various ages, all positioned in the same restraint system that currently held Austin Blake's body. Marcus opened one of the folders at random and immediately wished he hadn't. The photographs inside documented the systematic torture of a middle-aged man over what appeared to be several months. Like Austin, his eyes had been replaced with cameras, and the images showed the progressive deterioration of his physical and mental condition as Brittany subjected him to increasingly elaborate forms of abuse. "How many?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Kyle was counting the folders with shaking hands. 17. 17 separate victims over the past 3 years. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as backup arrived, but Marcus barely noticed. He was staring at a wall covered with what appeared to be a detailed map of Riverside and the surrounding areas. Red pins marked dozens of locations throughout the town, connected by colored string that formed a complex web of relationships and connections. Each pin was labeled with a name and a date. Some he recognized, residents who had been reported missing over the past few years, their cases eventually going cold when no evidence could be found. Others were names he'd never heard before, suggesting that Brittany's activities had gone far beyond what the local police had ever suspected. But it was the blue pins that made Marcus's hands tremble as he studied the map. These marked locations where Brittany had apparently been observing potential future victims, studying their routines and habits before making her move. And scattered throughout Riverside were dozens of blue pins, suggesting that her work was far from finished. One blue pin caught his attention immediately. It was placed at the address where he lived with his wife and 2 daughters. Detective Sarah Rodriguez arrived within 20 minutes, followed closely by a full forensics team and the county coroner. She took one look at the scene inside the storage unit and immediately called for additional resources from the state police, recognizing that they were dealing with something far beyond the capabilities of the Riverside Police Department. "We're going to need to evacuate a 6-block radius around this facility," she told Marcus as they stood outside the storage unit, watching crime scene technicians photograph every inch of the interior. "If she's been conducting chemical experiments in there, we don't know what kind of contamination we're dealing with." "What about Brittany Kellerman? Any sign of her?" Rodriguez shook her head. "The Honda Pilot is still in the Supermart parking lot. No activity on her credit cards, no cell phone pings. It's like she vanished into thin air after walking out of that store." "Except now we know she didn't vanish," Marcus said. "She transformed. Everything about her behavior on that security footage makes sense now. She wasn't the victim of some random crime. She was a predator who decided it was time to disappear before anyone could connect her to all this." They were interrupted by one of the forensics technicians, a young woman who looked pale and shaken as she approached with a clipboard full of preliminary findings. "Detective Rodriguez, we found something else. There's a hidden panel in the back wall of the storage unit. Behind it is what appears to be a second chamber." Marcus and Rodriguez followed the technician back into the storage unit, where other members of the team had removed a section of what had appeared to be solid wall to reveal a smaller room beyond. This space contained more sophisticated equipment: computer monitors, recording devices, and what looked like a surgical suite, complete with an operating table and medical instruments. But it was the walls of this hidden chamber that provided the most chilling revelation. They were covered from floor to ceiling with television screens, each one showing a different view from the cameras that had been implanted in Brittany's victims. Some screens showed only darkness, suggesting the victims were deceased, but others displayed moving images. Terrified eyes darting back and forth, tears streaming down faces that couldn't be seen. "My God," Rodriguez whispered. "She's still got some of them. They're still alive." A technician was already working to trace the signals from the various camera feeds, trying to determine where the surviving victims were being held. The feeds appeared to be coming from multiple locations throughout the county, suggesting that Brittany had established several different facilities for her experiments. Marcus studied the screens showing active feeds, trying to identify anything that might help locate the victims. One screen caught his attention. The view showed what appeared to be a residential basement, with distinctive stone walls and an old-fashioned coal furnace that looked familiar. "I know where this is," he said suddenly. "That basement. I've seen it before." Rodriguez looked at him expectantly. 3 months ago, we responded to a wellness check at 1247 Elm Street. Elderly woman named Dorothy Morrison hadn't been seen for a few days, but when we checked the house, it was empty. We assumed she'd gone to stay with relatives and forgotten to tell anyone. But that basement, Marcus pointed at the screen. Same stone walls, same old furnace. "Get units to that address immediately," Rodriguez ordered. "And check the property records. I want to know who owns that house now." As police cars raced toward Elm Street, Marcus continued studying the wall of monitors, looking for other locations he might recognize. The scale of Brittany's operation was becoming clear. She hadn't just been abducting and torturing individual victims. She had been systematically targeting isolated members of the community, people whose disappearances wouldn't be immediately noticed or investigated. The elderly, the mentally ill, transients, and troubled teenagers like Austin Blake, all people who existed on the margins of Riverside's suburban community, invisible to most of their neighbors until they vanished entirely. "Detective," one of the technicians called out, "we've got something else. There's a computer terminal back here that appears to be connected to a much larger network. It looks like she was sharing these feeds with other people. Rodriguez and Marcus hurried to the computer, where a technician was scrolling through what appeared to be a sophisticated online platform. The interface resembled a social media site, but instead of family photos and status updates, it hosted live streams of torture sessions and detailed discussions about experimental techniques. Jesus, Rodriguez said. She was part of some kind of network. This isn't just one disturbed individual, it's an organized group. The user profiles visible on the screen showed people from across the country, possibly around the world, all participating in what appeared to be a shared obsession with human experimentation and torture. They exchanged techniques, compared results, and even wagered on the outcomes of various procedures. Brittany's profile, operating under the username Suburban Scientist, showed her to be one of the most active members of the community. Her posts detailed every aspect of her experiments, complete with photographs and video documentation. The comments from other users were filled with praise for her innovative techniques and requests for more detailed documentation of her procedures. But it was the private message section of her profile that revealed the most disturbing information. In the days leading up to her disappearance from the supermart, Brittany had been exchanging increasingly frantic messages with someone identified only as Master Experimenter. Master Experimenter. Local authorities getting too close. Time to implement exit strategy. Suburban Scientist. But I'm not finished with my current subjects. The data collection is at a critical phase. Master Experimenter. Data can be preserved remotely. Subjects are expendable. Your safety is paramount to the community. Suburban Scientist. Understood. Initiating Protocol 7. Master Experimenter. Extraction team will be at secondary location Thursday evening. Bring essential research only. Suburban Scientist. What about cleanup? Master Experimenter. That's not your concern anymore. The message thread ended there, but it painted a clear picture of what had happened. Brittany hadn't disappeared spontaneously. Her vanishing act had been carefully planned and coordinated with a larger organization. And if the messages were accurate, she was already long gone, extracted by professionals who specialized in helping wanted criminals disappear. We need to contact the FBI, Rodriguez said. This is way beyond a local missing persons case. We're dealing with an organized network of serial killers, and they've got resources we can't match. As if summoned by her words, Marcus's radio crackled to life with an update from the units that had been dispatched to Elm Street. Detective Rodriguez, this is Unit 12. We're at 1247 Elm Street and... Christ, you need to get down here right away. We found them. We found the basement from the video feed, and there are 3 people down here. They're alive, but barely. What's their condition? 2 elderly females and 1 male, approximately 40 years old. All have surgical modifications to their eyes, similar to what we saw at the storage unit. They appear to be severely malnourished and dehydrated, but they're conscious. EMTs are en route. Rodriguez turned to Marcus. I want you to head to Elm Street and coordinate the rescue operation. I'm going to stay here and work with the feds to trace this network. As Marcus drove toward Elm Street, his mind was racing with the implications of what they'd discovered. Brittany Kellerman had been living a double life that was more elaborate and more horrifying than anything he'd encountered in his career. She had successfully maintained the facade of a devoted suburban mother while systematically torturing members of her own community for the entertainment of a global network of sadists. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that she hadn't been working alone. Somewhere in Riverside, possibly living in a house just like the one Marcus went home to every night, other members of this network were continuing their work. The blue pins on Brittany's map suggested that multiple victims had been identified and were being watched, waiting for their turn to disappear into the nightmare world that existed just beneath the surface of suburban normalcy. As he pulled up to 1247 Elm Street, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Brittany's disappearance wasn't the end of their investigation. It was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than anyone in Riverside had ever imagined. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about that blue pin placed at his home address, and what it might mean for his own family's safety. The basement at 1247 Elm Street was a chamber of horrors that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his career. The 3 victims they found there had been reduced to barely human shells, their eyes replaced with the same camera systems they'd seen on Austin Blake, their bodies bearing evidence of months of systematic torture and experimentation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the elderly woman who lived 2 blocks from Marcus's own house, had been missing for 8 months. Her family had assumed she'd moved to an assisted living facility after she stopped answering their calls, never reporting her disappearance to police. Now she lay on a makeshift operating table, conscious but unable to speak, her throat bearing surgical scars that suggested her vocal cords had been deliberately damaged. The second victim, Margaret Foster, had been homeless before her disappearance, one of the invisible people that most of Riverside's residents pretended not to see as she pushed her shopping cart through downtown areas and slept in doorways. No one had reported her missing because no one had considered her worth missing. The third victim was the most shocking discovery. James Morrison was a respected high school mathematics teacher who had supposedly taken early retirement and moved to Florida to care for his aging mother. His colleagues had thrown him a farewell party just 6 months earlier, never suspecting that his sudden departure was actually the beginning of his descent into Brittany Kellerman's private hell. All 3 victims were alive but severely traumatized, their minds shattered by months of unimaginable abuse. The cameras in their eye sockets continued to broadcast their suffering to the online network that had been funding and encouraging Brittany's experiments. As EMTs worked to stabilize the victims for transport to the county medical center, Marcus coordinated with Detective Rodriguez and the FBI agents who had arrived to take over the investigation. The scope of what they'd uncovered was far beyond anything the Riverside Police Department was equipped to handle. Special Agent Diana Reeves from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had reviewed the evidence from the storage unit and determined that they were dealing with what she termed a distributed torture network, an organized group of individuals who shared resources, techniques, and victims across multiple jurisdictions. This isn't random violence, Agent Reeves explained as she briefed the local officers at an emergency command post set up in the Supermart parking lot. What we're seeing here is a sophisticated operation that's been running for years, possibly decades. They recruit members who appear to be model citizens, people with stable jobs, families, social connections that provide cover for their activities. She gestured to a large whiteboard where technicians had mapped out the connections they'd discovered in Brittany's computer files. The network extended across state lines, with active members in at least 12 different states and corresponding relationships with international contacts. Brittany Kellerman wasn't acting alone, and she wasn't the leader of this organization. Based on the communications we've recovered, she was what they call a field researcher, someone who conducted experiments and collected data for higher-ranking members of the network. Marcus studied the organizational chart that was emerging on the whiteboard. The network was structured like a corporation, with specialized roles for different types of members. Scouts identified and tracked potential victims, researchers conducted experiments, cleaners disposed of evidence, and facilitators provided resources and coordination. "What happened to trigger her disappearance?" Rodriguez asked. "Someone tipped them off that law enforcement was getting close," Agent Reeves replied. "We're still analyzing the communications, but it appears they have sources within various police departments who warn them when investigations are getting too close to their activities." The implication hung heavy in the air. Somewhere within their own ranks, possibly within the Riverside Police Department itself, was someone who had been feeding information to this network of killers. "How do we identify the source?" Marcus asked. Very carefully, Agent Reeves said. If they realize we know about the leak, they'll just go deeper underground. Right now they think Brittany's disappearance was a successful extraction. They don't know we've found her laboratory or rescued her victims. That gives us a temporary advantage. Over the following hours, as the investigation expanded to include multiple agencies and jurisdictions, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The network had been operating for at least 15 years, growing from a small group of like-minded individuals who met in online forums to a sophisticated criminal organization with resources that rivaled those of drug cartels or terrorist groups. They had developed their own communication protocols, financial systems, and operational security procedures. Members were recruited through carefully structured psychological evaluations designed to identify individuals with the right combination of intelligence, sadistic tendencies, and social camouflage to be valuable assets to the organization. The most chilling discovery came when FBI analysts managed to crack the encryption on the network's central communication server. The system contained detailed profiles on thousands of potential victims across the country, complete with personal information, daily routines, family relationships, and vulnerability assessments. Marcus recognized dozens of names from his own community: elderly residents who lived alone, struggling single parents, people dealing with mental health issues or substance abuse problems. Anyone who might disappear without immediate notice had been cataloged and evaluated as potential subjects for the network's experiments. But it wasn't just the vulnerable who had been targeted. The network also maintained files on law enforcement personnel, government officials, and community leaders, apparently as insurance against potential investigation or prosecution. Marcus's own file contained detailed information about his family, his work schedule, his mortgage payments, and even his daughter's school activities. They've been watching all of us, Rodriguez said as she reviewed her own file. Building leverage, looking for pressure points they could use if they needed to discourage an investigation. Agent Reeves nodded grimly. This level of intelligence gathering suggests they have significant resources and technical capabilities. We're not dealing with a group of amateur sadists. This is a professional criminal organization with deep pockets and long-term strategic planning. The breakthrough came when analysts discovered that the network's financial transactions were being processed through a series of shell companies registered in Delaware. The paper trail led to an investment firm in Manhattan that appeared to be legitimate on the surface, but was actually serving as a front for the network's operations. Within hours of that discovery, coordinated raids were being planned across multiple states. But as federal agents prepared to move against the network's leadership, Marcus received a call that changed everything. Officer Thompson, this is Dr. Helen Carter at Riverside General Hospital. We need you down here immediately. It's about the victims you rescued from Elm Street. When Marcus arrived at the hospital, he found Dr. Carter waiting for him in the intensive care unit, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. What's wrong? Are they going to be okay? Physically, they'll recover, Dr. Carter said. But that's not why I called you. There's something else. Something we discovered during the medical examinations. She led him to a small conference room where X-ray images were displayed on a light board. The images showed the internal structure of the victims' skulls, revealing sophisticated electronic devices that had been implanted in their brains. These aren't just cameras, Dr. Carter explained. These devices are capable of both recording and transmitting neurological signals. In essence, the network wasn't just watching what these people saw. They were recording their thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences. Marcus stared at the X-rays, trying to comprehend the implications of what he was seeing. Are you saying they were using these people as some kind of human recording devices? Worse than that, Dr. Carter replied. Based on the technology involved, these devices appear to be capable of two-way communication. They weren't just recording the victims' experiences, they were potentially able to influence their thoughts and behavior as well. The revelation cast everything they'd discovered in a new light. The network wasn't just torturing people for entertainment. They were conducting advanced neurological experiments, possibly developing technology that could be used for mind control or psychological manipulation. "Doctor, is there any way to remove these devices safely?" Dr. Carter shook her head. The surgery would be extremely risky. The devices are integrated into critical areas of the brain, and attempting to remove them could cause permanent damage or death. For now, all we can do is monitor the victims and try to block any incoming signals. As Marcus left the hospital, his phone rang with an update from Agent Reeves. "We've got a problem," she said without preamble. "The raids we planned for tomorrow morning, someone leaked the information. All the target locations have been abandoned, and the suspects have disappeared." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. How is that possible? There's definitely a source within law enforcement, and they're higher up than we initially thought. Someone with access to federal investigation plans, not just local police intelligence. The implications were staggering. The network's infiltration of law enforcement was far more extensive than anyone had realized, extending possibly to the highest levels of federal agencies. "What about Brittany Kellerman? Any trace of her?" "Nothing. It's like she never existed. All her identification documents appear to have been expertly forged, her credit history fabricated, even her marriage certificate and her daughter's birth certificates. The woman who lived in Riverside for 6 years, who everyone thought they knew, was a complete fiction." Marcus thought about David Kellerman, still at home with his twin daughters, probably still hoping his wife would walk through the door with an explanation for her disappearance. How do you tell a man that his wife of 8 years, the mother of his children, never existed at all? "There's something else," Agent Reeves continued. "We managed to trace some of the network's communications, and there are references to something called Project Suburban. It appears to be a large-scale operation involving multiple communities across the Midwest." "What kind of operation?" "We're not sure yet, but based on the communications we've intercepted, Riverside was just one of several test sites. They've been running similar operations in at least 6 other small cities, using them as laboratories to refine their techniques and technology." As Marcus drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside, everything looked different now. The neat suburban houses with their manicured lawns and 2-car garages no longer represented safety and normalcy. Instead, they seemed like potential hiding places for monsters who had learned to masquerade as ordinary neighbors and community members. At every stop sign and traffic light, he found himself studying the faces of other drivers, wondering which ones might be part of the network. The elderly man walking his dog, the woman pushing a stroller, the teenager on his bicycle. Any of them could be scouts, researchers, or facilitators in an organization that viewed human suffering as raw material for their experiments. When he finally reached his own house, Marcus sat in his driveway for several minutes before going inside. The blue pin on Brittany's map had marked this location as a target, which meant that someone in the network had been watching his family, studying their routines, evaluating their potential as victims. His wife, Jennifer, met him at the door, her face creased with worry. "Marcus, you look terrible. What's wrong?" How could he explain that their quiet, suburban community had been infiltrated by an organization of sophisticated criminals who viewed torture and murder as scientific research? How could he tell her that their neighbor, the woman who had carpooled their daughters to soccer practice, had been part of a network that was systematically abducting and experimenting on members of their community? "It's the Kellerman case," he said finally. "It's more complicated than we initially thought." Jennifer nodded, accustomed to her husband's reluctance to discuss disturbing cases at home. But as they sat down for dinner with their daughters, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the network's attention to his family might not have been entirely random. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrifying question began to form. If Brittany Kellerman could live next door for 6 years without anyone suspecting her true nature, how many other members of the network were still out there, continuing their work while the community slept peacefully in the illusion of suburban safety? 3 weeks after the discovery of Brittany Kellerman's torture laboratory, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in the abandoned house at 1247 Elm Street, staring at the basement where they'd rescued 3 broken human beings. The FBI had finished processing the scene, but Marcus kept returning here, drawn by questions that refused to leave him alone. The official investigation was winding down. Federal agents had dismantled what they could find of the network's infrastructure, arresting 17 people across 6 states. The raids had netted computer servers, financial records, and enough evidence to ensure that most of the arrested individuals would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. But Brittany Kellerman remained a ghost. Despite an international manhunt and coordination with law enforcement agencies worldwide, no trace of her had been found. The sophisticated extraction operation that had spirited her away from Riverside appeared to have been flawlessly executed, leaving behind only questions and the wreckage of lives destroyed by her experiments. The 3 victims from the Elm Street basement were slowly recovering at a specialized medical facility in Chicago. The neural implants in their brains had been successfully deactivated, though doctors remained uncertain about the long-term effects of the technology. Dr. Patricia Williams had regained some of her speech, but her memories of the months in captivity remained fragmented and traumatic. Margaret Foster had been placed in a long-term care facility, her mind too damaged to function independently. James Morrison had returned to a semblance of normal life, but colleagues noted that the former mathematics teacher now flinched at sudden movements and spoke in whispers. Austin Blake's funeral had been held on a rainy Thursday morning, attended by his mother, a handful of classmates, and several police officers who felt they owed him that much respect. The coroner's report had concluded that he'd survived nearly 3 weeks in Brittany's storage unit laboratory before his heart finally stopped. 3 weeks of unimaginable suffering that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his career. David Kellerman had moved away from Riverside with his daughters, unable to bear living in the house where he'd shared 6 years of marriage with a woman who had never existed. Before leaving, he'd given Marcus a small cardboard box containing the only items he couldn't bring himself to throw away: family photographs that documented a life built on lies. Marcus had looked through those photos countless times, studying Brittany's face in each image, searching for some sign of the monster that had been hiding beneath the surface. But there was nothing. In every picture, she looked like exactly what she'd pretended to be: a loving mother, devoted wife, and active community member. The most disturbing photograph showed Brittany at a PTA meeting, sitting next to Mrs. Blake as they planned a school fundraiser. Austin's mother had been completely unaware that the woman beside her was already grooming her son for an horrific death. Still trying to figure out how you missed it? Marcus turned to find Detective Rodriguez standing in the basement doorway. She'd been promoted to lead detective following the successful resolution of the case, though both of them knew that successful was a relative term when the primary suspect had vanished without a trace. "I keep thinking there had to be signs," Marcus replied. "Something we should have noticed, some behavior that should have raised red flags." Rodriguez descended the basement steps, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. "The FBI profiler said that's exactly what makes these people so dangerous. They're not crazy in any way we can easily identify. They're highly functional psychopaths who've learned to mimic normal human behavior perfectly. But for 6 years, living with a husband and children, participating in community events, maintaining friendships, how does someone fake that level of emotional connection for so long?" "Maybe she wasn't faking all of it," Rodriguez suggested. "Maybe she genuinely cared about her family, even while she was torturing strangers in her spare time. People are capable of compartmentalizing in ways that don't make sense to the rest of us." Marcus considered this possibility, but it somehow made the whole situation even more disturbing. The idea that Brittany could genuinely love her daughters while simultaneously conducting the most depraved experiments imaginable on other people's children suggested a level of psychological fragmentation that defied comprehension. His phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Reeves, who had remained in contact even after the federal investigation officially concluded. "New development. Can you meet me at the supermart in an hour?" Marcus and Rodriguez arrived at the grocery store to find Agent Reeves waiting in the parking lot beside a black SUV. She looked tired and frustrated, her usually professional demeanor showing cracks that suggested the case was taking a personal toll. "We got a break," she said without preamble. "The network we thought we'd dismantled? It was just one cell of a much larger organization. The people we arrested were middle management at best." She handed Marcus a tablet displaying what appeared to be a complex organizational chart. "This is what we've pieced together from the servers we seized. The torture network was just one division of something called the Suburban Initiative, a massive research project that's been running for over 20 years. Marcus studied the chart, noting connections that extended to universities, pharmaceutical companies, government contractors, and private research foundations. What kind of research? Behavioral modification, psychological conditioning, neural interface technology. They're developing methods to control human behavior on a large scale. The torture experiments were just one aspect of a broader program to understand how the human mind responds to various forms of trauma and conditioning." Rodriguez leaned over Marcus's shoulder to examine the chart. "You're saying this wasn't just sadism? They had some kind of scientific purpose?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. The network has been conducting illegal human experiments under the guise of various legitimate research programs. They recruit subjects from vulnerable populations, the homeless, the mentally ill, isolated elderly people, and use them as test subjects for technologies that could theoretically be used for everything from treating PTSD to creating perfect soldiers." Agent Reeves tapped the screen, highlighting a section of the organizational chart labeled Community Integration Studies. Riverside was designated as a test site for something called Project Suburban, an experiment in community-wide psychological manipulation. They wanted to see if they could establish control over an entire population without anyone realizing what was happening. "What kind of control?" Marcus asked. "We're still analyzing the data, but it appears they were testing various methods of social engineering, manipulating local politics, influencing economic decisions, even controlling which people got married and had children. Brittany Kellerman wasn't just conducting torture experiments. She was studying how to psychologically manipulate an entire community." The implications were staggering. Marcus thought about the various changes that had occurred in Riverside over the past few years. New businesses opening and closing, people moving in and out of the community, local elections that had seemed to produce unexpected results. How much of what they'd assumed was natural social evolution had actually been carefully orchestrated manipulation? "The really disturbing part," Agent Reeves continued, "is that Riverside wasn't their first test site. We've identified at least 12 other communities where similar experiments were conducted over the past 2 decades. Some of those experiments are still ongoing." She showed them satellite images of small towns across the Midwest, each one marked with various colored indicators that supposedly represented different phases of the project. "They've been perfecting their techniques for years, learning how to gain influence over local institutions and gradually reshape entire communities according to their research goals." "But why?" Rodriguez asked. "What's the end game?" "We don't know yet. The communications we've intercepted suggest this is all preparation for something much larger, something they call the implementation. But we haven't been able to determine what that actually means." Marcus studied the satellite image of Riverside, noting the various markers that indicated locations of interest to the research project. His own house was marked with a blue indicator, along with dozens of other residences throughout the community. "Agent Reeves, when you say these experiments are still ongoing in other communities, do you mean?" "I mean that right now, as we speak, there are people living in small towns across America who have no idea they're being used as test subjects in illegal human experiments. The network we dismantled was just one tentacle of something much larger and more dangerous." She closed the tablet and looked at both officers with an expression that conveyed both determination and deep concern. The Bureau is putting together a multi-agency task force to investigate the suburban initiative, but it's going to take years to unravel the full scope of what they've been doing. In the meantime, we need to assume that some of their assets are still in place, still conducting experiments, still gathering data for whatever they're ultimately planning. As Agent Reeves drove away, Marcus and Rodriguez stood in the supermart parking lot where Brittany Kellerman had abandoned her Honda Pilot just weeks earlier. The store continued its normal operations, with customers coming and going as if nothing had ever happened. But Marcus now understood that the appearance of normalcy was itself potentially part of the experiment. How many of the people he could see? The elderly man loading groceries into his car, the young mother pushing her toddler in a shopping cart, the teenagers hanging out near the entrance. How many of them were genuine community members, and how many were researchers, assets, or test subjects in an experiment they didn't even know was happening? "Rodriguez," Marcus said as they walked back to their patrol car, "do you ever wonder if we actually solved anything? Or if we just uncovered one small piece of something so big that stopping it is impossible?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, watching a family load their groceries into a minivan. The children were laughing and arguing in the back seat, while their parents organized the bags in the cargo area, a scene of suburban domesticity that would have seemed perfectly normal just a month ago. "I think," she said finally, "that we saved 3 people who were being tortured to death, and we prevented Austin Blake's suffering from continuing indefinitely. That's not nothing. But Brittany Kellerman is still out there, and according to the FBI, she's part of something that makes her individual crimes look insignificant by comparison." "Yeah, she is. And maybe we'll never catch her, and maybe this suburban initiative thing is too big for us to stop. But that doesn't mean we stop doing our jobs. We keep investigating, we keep protecting people when we can, and we hope that someone smarter than us figures out how to bring down the whole organization." As they drove through the streets of Riverside, Marcus found himself studying every face, every house, every seemingly innocent interaction between neighbors. The network's infiltration of their community had been so complete, so sophisticated, that he wondered if they'd ever really understand the full extent of what had been done to them. But there was one question that continued to haunt him more than all the others, a question that he suspected would never be answered no matter how many arrests were made or how many federal investigations were launched. If the people behind the suburban initiative were capable of conducting such elaborate, long-term experiments on entire communities without detection, what did that say about the nature of reality itself? How many other aspects of modern American life were actually carefully controlled experiments designed to serve purposes that the general population couldn't even imagine? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if they could make someone like Brittany Kellerman appear to be a normal suburban mother for 6 years, how many other people in positions of trust and authority were actually something entirely different? Marcus pulled into his own driveway and sat for a moment, looking at his house, the same house that had been marked on Brittany's map as a target for surveillance or worse. Jennifer was visible through the kitchen window, helping their daughters with homework at the dining room table. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that should have been comforting. Instead, Marcus found himself wondering if his own family's apparent happiness and stability were genuine, or if they too were part of someone else's experiment, unknowing test subjects in a study of human behavior whose true purpose remained hidden in the shadows of an organization that viewed people as nothing more than laboratory rats. He got out of the car and walked toward his front door, but stopped on the porch to look back at the street where he'd lived for 8 years. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Neat houses with well-maintained lawns, children's bicycles left carelessly in driveways, the gentle hum of air conditioners and the distant sound of a lawnmower. But now he knew that appearances could be deceiving in ways that defied imagination, and that the monsters weren't hiding under beds or lurking in dark alleys. They were living next door, carpooling to school functions, and participating in PTA meetings while they planned unspeakable horrors for their neighbors' children. And somewhere out there, Brittany Kellerman was still conducting her research, still gathering data for an organization that viewed human suffering as nothing more than raw material for their ongoing experiments. The case was closed, but the questions it raised would continue echoing through Riverside long after the last police report was filed and the last federal agent left town. Some mysteries, Marcus realized, weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to serve as reminders that the world was far darker and more complex than most people could bear to acknowledge. And sometimes, the most terrifying truth was that there were no answers, only the endless certainty that somewhere in the shadows, the experiments continued. Officer Samantha Reeves had worked plenty of missing person cases during her 8 years with the Lincoln County Police Department, but she'd never encountered anything quite like the disappearance of Walter Pierce. The 73-year-old retired accountant had vanished from Sunset Manor Nursing Home sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, leaving behind only a perfectly made bed and a trail of questions that grew more disturbing the deeper she dug. The call had come in at 7:15 a.m. from the facility's day shift supervisor, a harried-sounding woman named Linda Hartwell, who insisted that nothing like this had ever happened in her 20 years of nursing home administration. "We do bed checks every 4 hours," Linda had explained as she led Samantha through the sterile hallways of Sunset Manor. Walter was in his room at midnight when Jennifer made her rounds, sleeping peacefully. But when Debbie came through at 4 a.m., his bed was empty. The nursing home was one of those modern facilities that tried to maintain the illusion of being more like a hotel than a medical institution. Soft pastel colors, artificial plants, and piped-in classical music couldn't quite mask the underlying reality of institutional care. The medicinal smell, the distant sounds of confusion and distress, and the barely contained chaos of managing 200 elderly residents with varying degrees of physical and mental decline. Walter Pierce's room was on the second floor, down a long corridor lined with identical doors. Room 247 had been left exactly as they'd found it that morning, pending the police investigation. The bed was made with military precision, every corner tucked perfectly, the pillows arranged with geometric symmetry that suggested someone had taken considerable care with the presentation. "That's not how we make the beds here," Linda said, noticing Samantha's attention to the bedding. "Our housekeeping staff does good work, but nothing that precise. It's almost like whoever made that bed was trying to send a message." Samantha walked around the small room, noting the personal items that Walter had been allowed to keep: family photographs on the nightstand, a small bookshelf filled with paperback novels, a wooden chess set positioned as if he'd been in the middle of a game. Everything appeared normal except for one detail that raised immediate red flags. Walter's clothes were missing. "He would have been wearing pajamas to bed," Linda explained. "Standard issue for all our residents. Light blue cotton with the facility logo on the chest pocket. But we found those pajamas folded neatly in his dresser drawer, along with all his other clothes. It's like he got dressed and left voluntarily." "What about his medical condition? Was he physically capable of leaving on his own?" Linda consulted the clipboard she'd been carrying. Walter had mild dementia, but he was still quite mobile. He used a walker for stability, but he could get around independently during the day. The dementia mainly affected his short-term memory. He'd forget conversations or repeat questions, but he wasn't confused about basic things like getting dressed or finding his way around the facility. "Where's his walker now?" "That's another strange thing. It's right here in his room, exactly where it always is at night. If Walter left voluntarily, why didn't he take it with him? And how did he manage to walk out without assistance?" Samantha made notes as she examined the room more carefully. The window was on the second floor with no fire escape or external access, ruling out that exit route. Walter would have had to leave through the facility's main corridors, passing multiple security checkpoints and staff stations. "Tell me about your security system," Samantha said. "We have cameras in all the common areas and at every exit, plus magnetic locks on the doors that require key cards to open after hours. Only staff members have those cards, and the system logs every time one is used. I'll need to review all the footage from last night, plus the keycard logs. What about the staff who were working? I want to interview everyone who was on duty between midnight and 6 a.m. Linda's expression grew uncomfortable. "That might be complicated. We had some staffing issues last night." "What kind of issues?" "Jennifer Collins was supposed to work the overnight shift. She's been with us for 3 years, very reliable. But she called in sick at the last minute around 11 p.m. We had to pull in someone from our backup roster, a woman named Tiffany Martinez, who'd only been with us for about 2 weeks. Samantha felt the familiar tingle that came when seemingly random details started forming a pattern. "Where's Tiffany Martinez now?" "That's the problem. She was supposed to work until 7 a.m., but when the day shift arrived, she was gone, just left. Didn't clock out, didn't leave any notes about the residents, nothing. We've been trying to reach her all morning, but her phone goes straight to voicemail." "Do you have her employment file?" Linda nodded and led Samantha to the administrative offices on the first floor. The employee file for Tiffany Martinez was surprisingly thin. Just a completed application form, a copy of her driver's license, and documentation of a basic background check that had apparently found nothing concerning. But as Samantha studied the application, several details stood out as unusual. The previous employment history listed 3 different nursing facilities in other states, all within the past 2 years. The references provided were all from supervisors who were no longer with those facilities. Her emergency contact was listed as a sister in California, but the phone number was disconnected when Linda tried to call it during the hiring process. "This is a red flag employment history," Samantha said. "Constantly moving between facilities, references that can't be verified, emergency contacts that don't exist. How did she pass your hiring screening?" Linda looked embarrassed. "We've been having trouble finding qualified overnight staff. The pay isn't great, and it's a difficult shift. When someone applies who has experience and passes the background check, we tend to hire them quickly, maybe too quickly." "What did the background check actually verify? No criminal history, valid driver's license, eligible to work in the United States, the standard stuff." Samantha made a mental note to run a more thorough check on Tiffany Martinez through law enforcement databases. Something about the timing of Jennifer Collins' sudden illness and the mysterious new employee's disappearance felt orchestrated rather than coincidental. "I need to see the security footage now," Samantha said. The security office was located in the basement of the facility, staffed by a single guard who monitored multiple screens showing views from cameras throughout the building. The guard on duty, a middle-aged man named Christopher Torres, looked exhausted and stressed as he pulled up the previous night's recordings. "I've been going over this footage all morning," he said. "It doesn't make sense. Watch this." He started the playback at 11:30 p.m., showing the main lobby and corridors as the facility settled into its nighttime routine. Jennifer Collins could be seen leaving through the main entrance at 11:45 p.m., apparently heading home after calling in sick. 15 minutes later, Tiffany Martinez arrived and checked in with the security desk. "She seemed normal when she got here," Christopher said. "Professional, knew the procedures, didn't act nervous or suspicious, but watch what happens around 2 a.m. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. when something strange occurred on the second-floor corridor camera. Tiffany Martinez appeared on screen, walking down the hallway toward Walter Pierce's room. She paused outside his door for several minutes, appearing to have a conversation with someone, though the camera angle didn't show who might be inside the room. "There's no audio on these cameras," Christopher explained. "But it looks like she's talking to someone for about 10 minutes. Then watch this." At 2:28 a.m., Tiffany turned and walked back down the corridor, disappearing from view. She didn't reappear on any camera for the rest of the night. "That's impossible," Samantha said. "She had to show up somewhere else in the building. People don't just vanish." That's what I thought too. But I've checked every camera, every angle. After 2:28 a.m., it's like she ceased to exist, and there's no record of her using a key card to leave the building. Samantha studied the footage more carefully, paying attention to details that might have been missed. What about this corridor? Is there anywhere she could have gone that wouldn't be visible on camera? Just the supply closets and the resident rooms. But all the closets require keycards to access, and there's no log of her using her card after the initial entry. Show me Walter's room during that time period. Christopher switched to a different camera angle that covered the area around room 247. The timestamp showed 2:15 a.m. when Tiffany Martinez first appeared outside Walter's door. She stood there for exactly 12 minutes, definitely speaking to someone inside the room, occasionally gesturing as if explaining something complex. Then, at 2:27 a.m., the door to Walter's room opened and two figures emerged: Tiffany Martinez and Walter Pierce. But something was wrong with Walter's appearance. Instead of the pajamas he should have been wearing, he was fully dressed in street clothes, moving without his walker and showing none of the hesitation or confusion typical of dementia patients navigating unfamiliar situations in the middle of the night. "Freeze it there," Samantha said. "Look at Walter's face." Christopher paused the footage and zoomed in on Walter Pierce's image. Even with the poor resolution of the security camera, it was clear that his expression was completely blank. No emotion, no recognition, no sign of the personality that his family and caregivers knew. He looked like a man in a trance. "They walk off camera together," Christopher continued the playback. "And then neither of them appears anywhere else in the building. It's like they both just vanished." Samantha spent the next hour reviewing every available camera angle, looking for any sign of where Walter Pierce and Tiffany Martinez might have gone. The building's security system was comprehensive, covering all public areas, exits, and common spaces. There were blind spots, but none that would allow two people to move from the second floor to outside the building without being detected. "Christopher, is there any way to disable the cameras remotely, or to create a gap in the recording? Not without physical access to the equipment down here, or administrative access to the computer system. And the logs show continuous recording all night, no gaps or interruptions." Samantha was beginning to suspect they were dealing with something more sophisticated than a simple abduction or voluntary disappearance. The level of planning required to make two people vanish from a secured facility without leaving any trace suggested professional expertise and advanced knowledge of the security systems. "I need the complete employee file for Tiffany Martinez," she said, "plus any security footage from the parking lot and a list of everyone who has administrative access to your computer systems." As Christopher gathered the requested materials, Samantha's phone buzzed with a text message from her partner, Officer Daniel Rodriguez, who had been following up on background information. "Just talked to Jennifer Collins about her sick call last night. Says she never called in sick. Was planning to work her regular shift, but got a call around 10 p.m. from someone claiming to be Linda Hartwell, saying they didn't need her because they had extra coverage. Jennifer assumed it was legitimate and stayed home." Samantha felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Someone had impersonated the facility administrator to manipulate the staffing schedule, ensuring that Tiffany Martinez would be the only staff member on Walter's floor during the critical hours. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned operation. But why target Walter Pierce? A 73-year-old retired accountant with mild dementia didn't seem like an obvious choice for abduction. Unless there was something about his background that made him valuable to someone with the resources and expertise to execute such a sophisticated operation. Samantha called Rodriguez back. "I need you to run a deep background check on Walter Pierce. Employment history, financial records, family connections, everything you can find. and get me contact information for his family members. I want to know if there's anything in his past that might explain why someone would go to this much trouble to take him." As she waited for the background information, Samantha continued reviewing the security footage, looking for details she might have missed. The more she studied the images of Walter Pierce leaving his room, the more convinced she became that his behavior was not natural. His movements were too coordinated for someone with dementia. His expression too vacant for someone making a conscious decision to leave. It looked like he was being controlled somehow, guided by external influence rather than acting on his own volition. But that suggested capabilities that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to real-world criminal activity. Rodriguez called back within an hour with information that transformed the investigation completely. "You're not going to believe what I found about Walter Pierce," he said. "The guy wasn't just an accountant. From 1975 to 1995, he worked for a Department of Defense contractor called Advanced Research Solutions. His security clearance was top secret, and his work involved classified projects related to psychological warfare and behavior modification." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of behavior modification? The records are heavily redacted, but it appears he was involved in developing techniques for what they called cognitive influence operations. Basically, methods for controlling or manipulating human behavior without the subject's awareness. Daniel, are you telling me that Walter Pierce spent 20 years developing mind control technology for the government? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And get this. Advanced Research Solutions was shut down in 1995 following a congressional investigation into unauthorized human experimentation. Several employees were indicted, but Walter Pierce was never charged. He took early retirement and moved to Lincoln County, where he's been living quietly ever since. The implications were staggering. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to abduct a man who possessed knowledge of classified behavior modification techniques developed by the government 30 years ago. But who would want that information, and what did they plan to do with it? "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "I found death certificates for 3 other former employees of Advanced Research Solutions, all within the past 6 months. Natural causes in every case, heart attacks, strokes, that kind of thing. But all 3 were around Walter's age. All had similar security clearances and all died in different states under circumstances that didn't raise suspicion at the time. Someone's been systematically eliminating people with knowledge of these classified projects. That's what it looks like. And Walter Pierce was probably next on the list, except instead of killing him quietly, they decided to take him alive." Samantha looked back at the frozen security footage showing Walter's blank expression as he left his room with Tiffany Martinez. If Rodriguez's theory was correct, they weren't dealing with a random kidnapping or even organized crime. They were looking at what appeared to be a professional intelligence operation designed to extract classified information from a retired government contractor. But that raised an even more disturbing question. Who had the resources and motivation to conduct such an operation? And what did they plan to do with behavior modification techniques that the U.S. government had deemed too dangerous to continue developing? As Samantha drove back to the police station to coordinate with federal authorities, she couldn't shake the feeling that Walter Pierce's disappearance was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple missing person case. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered how many other elderly residents in nursing homes across the country might be harboring secrets that someone was willing to kill for. The FBI field office in Kansas City looked exactly like what it was. A sterile monument to bureaucratic efficiency, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Agent Trevor Morrison had agreed to meet Samantha there after her phone call about Walter Pierce's background, but his expression suggested this wasn't the first time he'd heard about missing persons with connections to classified government projects. "Advanced Research Solutions," Agent Morrison said, consulting a thick file folder as they sat in a windowless conference room. "We've been tracking incidents related to former ARS employees for the past 8 months. Walter Pierce makes number 17. Samantha felt her stomach drop. 17 people have disappeared? Not all disappeared. Some died under circumstances that appeared natural at first glance. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents. But when you start looking at the statistical probability of that many deaths among such a specific population, the pattern becomes obvious." Agent Morrison opened his file and spread out a collection of photographs and documents across the conference table. Each photo showed an elderly person, men and women in their 60s and 70s, along with brief biographical summaries and death certificates or missing person reports. "Advanced Research Solutions was shut down in 1995, he continued, but the research they were conducting never really stopped. It just moved underground, split between private contractors and classified programs that operate without congressional oversight." "What kind of research are we talking about? Behavior modification? Psychological conditioning? Neural interface technology? The kind of stuff that sounds like science fiction until you see it in action." Morrison picked up one of the photos. Dr. Margaret, former ARS neuroscientist, found dead in her home in Portland 6 months ago. Apparent heart attack, but the autopsy revealed traces of a synthetic compound that can induce cardiac arrest while leaving minimal forensic evidence. He selected another photo. Robert Hendricks, ARS behavioral psychologist, disappeared from a memory care facility in Denver 3 months ago. Security footage shows him leaving voluntarily with a nurse who was later determined to be an imposter using sophisticated identity documents. The similarities to Walter Pierce's case were unmistakable. Samantha studied the photographs, noting that all the victims appeared to have been specifically targeted based on their knowledge of classified research from decades past. "Agent Morrison, who's doing this? And why now, after all these years?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. Our working theory is that someone, possibly a foreign intelligence service, possibly a private organization, is systematically acquiring personnel with knowledge of behavior modification techniques developed by the U.S. government. But these people are in their 70s and 80s, many with dementia. How valuable could their information really be?" Morrison's expression grew darker. "More valuable than you might think. The research conducted by Advanced Research Solutions was decades ahead of anything that's been publicly acknowledged. They developed techniques for controlling human behavior that make modern propaganda and social media manipulation look primitive by comparison." He pulled out a heavily redacted document and placed it in front of Samantha. "This is a partial summary of Project Mindbridge, one of ARS's most classified programs. They were developing methods to directly influence human thoughts and actions using a combination of pharmaceutical, technological, and psychological techniques." Samantha scanned the visible portions of the document, trying to make sense of the technical language and blacked-out sections. What she could read was deeply disturbing. References to cognitive override protocols, behavioral programming sequences, and remote neural influence systems. "Are you telling me they figured out how to control people's minds?" "In limited ways, under specific conditions, yes. The research was terminated because the ethical implications were considered unacceptable, even for a classified military program. But the knowledge still exists in the minds of the people who developed it. And now someone is collecting those people." "Exactly. We think they're trying to reconstruct the complete research database by extracting information from the original researchers. The people who are being killed probably refused to cooperate. The ones being kidnapped are presumably being subjected to more persuasive methods of information extraction." Samantha thought about the security footage of Walter Pierce leaving his room with that blank expression on his face. "Agent Morrison, is it possible that whoever took Walter is using these behavior modification techniques on him? Could they have somehow programmed him to walk out voluntarily?" Morrison nodded grimly. That's exactly what we think is happening. Based on other cases, they seem to have developed ways to temporarily override a person's conscious will, essentially turning them into a compliant asset who will follow instructions without resistance. The implications were terrifying. If the kidnappers possessed technology that could control human behavior, traditional law enforcement methods would be completely inadequate. How do you arrest someone who can make witnesses forget they saw anything, or convince police officers to ignore evidence? What can we actually do? Samantha asked. If these people have access to mind control technology, how do we even investigate them effectively? Very carefully, Morrison replied. We've learned not to trust standard interrogation techniques or eyewitness testimony in these cases. Physical evidence becomes much more important, and we have to assume that anyone involved in the investigation could potentially be compromised. He showed her another document, a map of the United States with red pins marking locations where ARS-related incidents had occurred. The pins were scattered across multiple states, but there seemed to be a concentration in the Midwest. We think they're operating out of a central facility somewhere in this region, Morrison said, circling an area that included parts of Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. Based on the timing and logistics of the kidnappings, we estimate they need to be within a 6-hour drive of most of the target locations. Any idea what kind of facility they'd need? Something large enough to house multiple subjects, isolated enough to avoid detection, and equipped with medical and research equipment. Probably a former military installation, defunct research facility, or private compound with significant infrastructure. Samantha studied the map, noting that Lincoln County fell squarely within the suspected operational area. Agent Morrison, if Walter Pierce is still alive, how much time do we have to find him? Based on previous cases, they typically extract what they need within 72 hours. After that, the subjects either die from the stress of the interrogation process or are eliminated to prevent them from providing information to law enforcement. Samantha looked at her watch. Walter had been missing for 18 hours, which meant they had less than 3 days to locate him before he joined the growing list of ARS researchers who would never share their secrets with anyone. I need to get back to Lincoln County and continue the investigation, she said. Is there anything else you can tell me that might help? Morrison gathered up the files and photographs. Watch for patterns in communication and logistics. These operations require significant coordination and resources. Someone is funding this, providing equipment and personnel, and managing information security at a very high level. What about Tiffany Martinez, the fake nurse? Almost certainly a professional operative using a sophisticated cover identity. She's probably long gone, but any information you can gather about her could help us identify the organization she works for. As Samantha drove back to Lincoln County, her mind was racing with the implications of what Agent Morrison had told her. The disappearance of Walter Pierce wasn't just a local crime. It was part of a systematic operation to acquire classified information that could potentially be used to control human behavior on a massive scale. But there was another possibility that Morrison hadn't mentioned, one that was almost too frightening to consider. What if the people behind these kidnappings weren't trying to learn about behavior modification techniques? What if they had already mastered them and were now using them for purposes that went far beyond information extraction? When she arrived back at the police station, Samantha found her partner, Daniel Rodriguez, waiting for her with a stack of printouts and a grim expression. I've been digging deeper into the background checks for nursing home employees, he said, and I found something that's going to make you very uncomfortable. He handed her a spreadsheet showing employment records for healthcare workers across a dozen different facilities in the region. Look at the dates when people with ARS connections disappeared, then look at when temporary or new employees were hired at their facilities. Samantha scanned the data and immediately saw the pattern Rodriguez had identified. In every case, someone with credentials similar to Tiffany Martinez had been hired within 2 weeks of an ARS-related disappearance or death. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. They've been infiltrating nursing homes and care facilities across multiple states, Rodriguez continued, placing operatives in positions where they can access vulnerable elderly residents, particularly those with backgrounds that might be of interest. How many facilities are we talking about? At least 15 that I've identified so far, possibly more. And here's the really disturbing part. Most of these operatives are still in place. They didn't disappear after completing their missions like Tiffany Martinez did. They're still working, still having access to residents, still gathering information. Samantha felt a chill as she realized the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about kidnapping former government researchers. It was about establishing a network of assets throughout the healthcare system who could identify, monitor, and potentially eliminate people with knowledge that someone considered valuable. Daniel, we need to contact every facility on this list and warn them that they may have infiltrators on their staff, and we need to do it without alerting the operatives that we know about them. Already thought of that, Rodriguez said. I've been working with the FBI to coordinate simultaneous interviews with facility administrators, but we have to assume that some of these operatives will realize what's happening and either disappear or escalate their activities. As if summoned by his words, Samantha's phone rang with a call from Linda Hartwell at Sunset Manor. Officer Reeves, thank God you answered. We have another problem. A big one. What's wrong? It's about Jennifer Collins, the nurse who called in sick the night Walter disappeared. She didn't call in sick. She's been found dead in her apartment. And it looks like she's been dead for at least 2 days. Samantha felt the pieces of a darker puzzle falling into place. Jennifer Collins hadn't called in sick on the night of Walter's disappearance because Jennifer Collins had already been murdered. Someone had killed her, stolen her identity information, and used it to manipulate the staffing schedule at Sunset Manor. Linda, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Lock down the facility immediately. Don't let anyone in or out without police authorization. And I need a complete list of every employee who's been hired in the past 6 months, along with their personnel files. Officer Reeves, what's going on? Are we in danger? Samantha thought about the network of infiltrators that Rodriguez had identified, the sophisticated operation that had successfully extracted Walter Pierce without leaving any usable evidence, and the growing list of elderly researchers who had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I think Walter's disappearance is just the beginning of something much bigger. As she hung up the phone, Samantha realized that their investigation had shifted from a missing person case to something that resembled a counterintelligence operation. They were dealing with professional adversaries who had resources, training, and objectives that went far beyond anything the Lincoln County Police Department was equipped to handle. But somewhere in the complex web of false identities, infiltrated facilities, and classified research projects, Walter Pierce was still alive and still valuable enough to keep breathing. Finding him had become more than just a matter of solving a crime. It had become a race against time to prevent classified information from falling into the hands of people who clearly understood its potential for causing harm on an unimaginable scale. And with every hour that passed, the odds of bringing Walter home alive grew smaller, while the likelihood of additional victims grew larger. The abandoned Hartwell Research Institute had been sitting empty for 12 years, slowly deteriorating in the Kansas prairie 40 miles outside of Topeka. Local teenagers sometimes dared each other to break in and explore the maze of empty laboratories and office buildings, but most found the place too unsettling to stay long. There was something about the institutional architecture and the lingering smell of chemicals that made even the boldest trespassers eager to leave. What those teenagers didn't know was that the facility wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. Officer Samantha Reeves discovered this 3 days after Walter Pierce's disappearance, following a lead that had emerged from the federal investigation into advanced research solutions. Agent Morrison had identified several former ARS facilities that remained privately owned despite appearing defunct, and Hartwell Research Institute was at the top of their list. The breakthrough had come from analyzing the cell phone data recovered from Jennifer Collins's apartment. The murdered nurse's phone showed several calls to a number registered to a company called Midwest Medical Staffing, which claimed to provide temporary healthcare workers to facilities across the region. But when agents attempted to contact the company, they found that its business address was a vacant strip mall office that had been empty for months. The phone number, however, provided a crucial lead. Cell tower data showed that calls to the Midwest Medical Staffing number were being routed to a location approximately 40 miles southwest of Lincoln County, exactly where the Hartwell Research Institute sat in apparent abandonment. Samantha had volunteered to conduct reconnaissance of the facility, despite Agent Morrison's reservations about sending local law enforcement into what was likely a sophisticated criminal operation. But she had argued successfully that a single police officer investigating reports of trespassing would arouse less suspicion than a federal task force and might provide the intelligence they needed to plan a successful rescue operation. Now, as she approached the facility in an unmarked car on a gray Wednesday afternoon, Samantha was beginning to question the wisdom of that decision. The Hartwell Research Institute consisted of 3 large buildings connected by covered walkways, surrounded by a chain-link fence that appeared to be in better repair than the deteriorating structures it protected. Warning signs, posted every 50 feet, declared the property to be private and dangerous due to contamination, discouraging casual exploration. But as Samantha parked her car at a service road intersection half a mile away and approached on foot, she could see signs that the facility was far from abandoned. The parking lot contained several vehicles, including a white van with medical equipment logos and what appeared to be a mobile laboratory unit. Power lines that should have been disconnected years ago were clearly active, and she could see lights in several windows of the main building. Using binoculars to survey the facility from a concealed position in a grove of trees, Samantha was able to observe a level of activity that suggested the Hartwell Institute was operating as a fully functional research facility, despite its official status as an abandoned property. She watched as personnel in medical scrubs moved between buildings, wheeling equipment and what appeared to be medical gurneys along the covered walkways. The operation looked professional and well-organized, with none of the improvised quality she might have expected from a criminal organization. But it was the arrival of a black sedan at 3:47 p.m. that confirmed her worst fears about what was happening inside the facility. The sedan pulled up to the main entrance, and Samantha watched through her binoculars as 2 people got out. A woman in a nurse's uniform who looked remarkably similar to the description of Tiffany Martinez, and an elderly man who moved with the same vacant, controlled demeanor she'd seen in the security footage of Walter Pierce leaving Sunset Manor. The elderly man was definitely not Walter. He appeared to be at least 10 years older and walked with a pronounced limp. But his behavior was identical to what she'd observed in the nursing home footage. Cooperative, but emotionless, following instructions without any sign of independent thought or resistance. As she watched, the woman guided the elderly man toward the main entrance, pausing to speak briefly with a security guard before disappearing inside the building. The entire interaction took less than 3 minutes, but it told Samantha everything she needed to know about the nature of the operation. The Hartwell Research Institute wasn't just a hiding place for kidnapped researchers. It was an active facility where multiple subjects were being brought for whatever process the organization was conducting. And if one elderly person was arriving while she watched, it meant that Walter Pierce was likely just one of several victims currently being held inside. Samantha called Agent Morrison on her secure radio. "I can confirm the facility is active," she reported. "Multiple buildings occupied, vehicles in the parking lot, and I just observed what appears to be the delivery of another elderly subject." "Any sign of Walter Pierce specifically?" "Negative, but the operational pattern matches what we saw at the nursing home. Professional personnel, subjects exhibiting behavioral control symptoms, sophisticated security procedures." "Roger that. We're mobilizing the tactical team now. Estimated arrival time is 45 minutes. Do not attempt entry until we arrive. Samantha acknowledged the instruction but continued her surveillance, hoping to gather additional intelligence that might help the rescue operation. What she saw over the next 30 minutes suggested that the situation was even more complex than they had initially understood. At regular intervals, personnel emerged from the main building to tend to what appeared to be a small cemetery behind the facility. Fresh graves were visible, along with several workers who seemed to be preparing additional burial sites. The implications were horrifying. Not all of the elderly researchers brought to this facility were leaving alive. But it was the activity she observed in the windows of the second building that provided the most disturbing revelation about what was happening at Hartwell Research Institute. Through a large window on the ground floor, Samantha could see what appeared to be a sophisticated medical facility equipped with examination tables, monitoring equipment, and what looked like surgical instruments. But the subjects on the examination tables weren't passive patients. They were restrained elderly people who appeared to be undergoing some kind of procedure that involved electronic devices being attached to their heads. Even from a distance, the scene reminded Samantha of descriptions she'd read about historical medical experiments conducted on unwilling subjects. But this facility was using modern technology and techniques, suggesting that whatever information they were extracting from their victims was being obtained through methods that were both highly advanced and completely unethical. Her radio crackled with an update from Agent Morrison. "Be advised. We've intercepted communications suggesting they may be planning to evacuate the facility tonight. Timeline has been moved up. Tactical Team ETA is now 20 minutes. Samantha felt a surge of urgency. If the operators were planning to abandon the facility, they would likely eliminate any evidence, including the research subjects who might be able to testify about what had been done to them. "Agent Morrison, I think they're going to kill the subjects before they evacuate. We may not have 20 minutes. "Negative, Officer Reeves. Do not attempt entry. That's an order." But as Samantha watched, she saw something that made the decision for her. Through the window of the main building, she could see an elderly man strapped to a medical table with what appeared to be electrodes attached to his head. Even at this distance, she recognized the distinctive profile. It was Walter Pierce, and he appeared to be conscious and in distress. Without waiting for backup, Samantha began moving toward the facility perimeter, knowing that every minute of delay might mean the difference between rescue and recovery of a body. The chain-link fence was equipped with motion sensors and surveillance cameras, but Samantha had observed a section near the loading dock where tall weeds provided concealment from most angles. She managed to cut through the fence using wire cutters from her patrol car toolkit, creating an opening just large enough to crawl through without triggering obvious alarms. The loading dock area was temporarily unguarded, allowing her to reach the rear entrance of the main building. The door was locked, but it was an older institutional lock that yielded to basic lock-picking techniques she'd learned during her police training. Inside, the facility was a maze of corridors lined with rooms that had been converted from research laboratories into holding cells and medical examination areas. The smell was a combination of disinfectant, human waste, and something else, a sweet, chemical odor that reminded Samantha of stories she'd heard about industrial accidents. She could hear voices coming from deeper in the building, along with the electronic beeping of medical monitoring equipment. Following the sounds, she located a central corridor that seemed to lead to the main operational area of the facility. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her career. The main laboratory had been converted into what could only be described as a human experimentation facility. A dozen examination tables were arranged in rows, each occupied by an elderly person in various stages of what appeared to be medical torture. Most of the subjects were unconscious, but a few were awake and clearly aware of their surroundings despite being unable to move or speak. Walter Pierce was on the table closest to a bank of monitoring equipment, with cables connected to devices that had been surgically implanted in his skull. His eyes were open and alert, tracking Samantha's movement as she entered the room. but he showed no other sign of voluntary muscle control. Standing over him was a woman in medical scrubs, definitely Tiffany Martinez, based on the photos Samantha had seen. She was adjusting settings on a complex electronic device while consulting a laptop computer that displayed what appeared to be brainwave patterns in real time. "The neural mapping is complete," Tiffany said to someone out of Samantha's line of sight. "We've successfully extracted the complete behavioral modification protocols from his long-term memory. The data transfer should be finished within the hour." A male voice responded from across the room. "Excellent. What about the other subjects from the ARS program?" "Subject 7 completed extraction yesterday. All the pharmaceutical conditioning data has been preserved. Subject 12 is still in process, but we should have the complete psychological programming protocols by tonight." Samantha realized she was witnessing the systematic extraction of classified information directly from the brains of the people who had developed it decades earlier. The technology being used was far beyond anything she had imagined possible, suggesting that whoever was behind this operation had resources and capabilities that rivaled those of major governments. But there was something else happening in the laboratory that was even more disturbing than the information extraction process. At several of the examination tables, the subjects appeared to be deceased, but their bodies were still connected to the monitoring equipment and showed signs of electrical activity. Somehow, the operators were continuing to access information from the brains of people who had died during the extraction process. The implications were staggering. Not only were they systematically murdering elderly researchers to steal their memories, but they had developed technology that could continue extracting information even after death. Samantha was preparing to call for immediate backup when her radio crackled to life, loudly enough to alert everyone in the laboratory to her presence. "Officer Reeves, this is Agent Morrison. Tactical team is in position. What's your status?" The male voice in the laboratory immediately responded to the radio transmission. "We have law enforcement on the property. Initiate sterilization protocol immediately." Tiffany Martinez began rapidly typing commands into her laptop, while other personnel Samantha hadn't seen before emerged from different areas of the laboratory. She found herself surrounded by at least 6 people, all of whom seemed to be armed and professionally trained. "Officer Reeves," one of them said calmly, "you're going to need to put down your weapon and surrender. This facility is conducting authorized research under classified government contracts. Your interference constitutes a federal crime." Samantha kept her service pistol drawn, but realized she was severely outgunned and outmaneuvered. "These people are being held against their will and subjected to medical torture. There's nothing authorized about what's happening here." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," the man replied. "These subjects are all volunteer participants in advanced medical research designed to treat severe neurological conditions. The procedures you've observed are experimental treatments for dementia and Alzheimer's disease." Even as he spoke, Samantha could see Tiffany Martinez and other personnel beginning to disconnect equipment and prepare what appeared to be an evacuation procedure. Whatever they were planning to do, they intended to complete it quickly and leave no evidence behind. "Officer Reeves," her radio crackled again. "Federal agents are entering the building now. Maintain your position." But as the sounds of the tactical team's entry echoed through the facility corridors, Samantha realized that the people operating this facility had been prepared for exactly this scenario. They weren't panicking or attempting to flee. They were executing a carefully planned response that suggested they had contingencies for law enforcement intervention. And as she looked at Walter Pierce's face, conscious and aware but completely helpless, she realized that whatever happened next would determine not just whether he survived, but whether the classified information in his mind would be used for purposes that could threaten far more people than just the elderly researchers who had been kidnapped and tortured in this nightmarish facility. The explosion that rocked the Hartwell Research Institute at 4:23 p.m. came without warning, sending a shockwave through the building that knocked Samantha to her knees and shattered every window in the main laboratory. Emergency lighting flickered on as the primary power systems failed, bathing the room in an eerie red glow that made the scene of medical horror even more nightmarish. In the chaos that followed the blast, Samantha lost sight of Tiffany Martinez and the other operatives who had surrounded her moments before. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed from other parts of the building as the federal tactical team engaged with what appeared to be a well-armed security force that had been hidden within the facility. But it was what happened to the experimental subjects that would haunt Samantha for the rest of her life. As smoke filled the laboratory and debris rained down from the damaged ceiling, the monitoring equipment connected to the 12 examination tables began displaying critical alerts. The subjects who had been unconscious started convulsing as their neural implants overloaded, while those who were still aware, including Walter Pierce, showed signs of extreme distress as electrical surges coursed through the devices embedded in their brains. Samantha fought her way through the smoke and debris to Walter's examination table, trying to disconnect the cables that were connected to the implant in his skull. But the electronic device was more sophisticated than she had realized, and her attempts to remove it seemed to be causing him even more pain. "Don't," a voice said behind her. "You'll kill him if you disconnect those cables wrong." Samantha spun around to find a man in medical scrubs standing behind her, one of the operatives who had been working on the other subjects. But instead of threatening her or attempting to stop her rescue effort, he appeared to be offering help. "The neural interfaces are designed to prevent tampering," he continued. "If you disconnect them incorrectly, the electrical feedback will cause massive brain damage." "Then help me disconnect them correctly," Samantha said, keeping her service weapon trained on him while trying to evaluate whether he was attempting to help or deceive her. "I can't," he replied. "I'm Dr. Matthew Harrison, and I used to work for Advanced Research Solutions. These people kidnapped me 6 months ago and have been forcing me to participate in this project by threatening my family." The building shook again as another explosion echoed through the facility, followed by the sound of helicopters landing outside. Agent Morrison's voice could be heard over a bullhorn, demanding that all personnel in the building surrender immediately. "Doctor, if you really want to help, tell me how to save these people." Dr. Harrison moved to a control console that had survived the initial explosion and began typing rapid commands. "The only way to safely disconnect the neural interfaces is through the main computer system, but they've initiated a sterilization protocol that will overload all the implants simultaneously in about 10 minutes. What does that mean? It means they're planning to kill all the subjects to prevent them from providing testimony about what was done to them. The electrical overload will destroy their brains while making it appear that they died from injuries sustained during the tactical assault." Samantha felt a surge of rage at the calculated cruelty of the plan. Not only had these people tortured elderly researchers to steal their memories, but they were prepared to murder all the evidence to cover their tracks. "Can you stop the sterilization protocol?" "Maybe, but I need about 15 minutes to override the security systems, and I don't think we have that long." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of combat grew closer as the tactical team fought their way through the building's defenses. Whoever was running this operation had prepared for the possibility of law enforcement intervention and had equipped the facility with military-grade security systems and personnel. "Dr. Harrison, do what you can with the computer systems. I'm going to try to evacuate as many subjects as possible." Samantha began disconnecting the simpler monitoring equipment from the examination tables, hoping to make the subjects more mobile without triggering the fatal overload that Dr. Harrison had warned about. Most of them were unconscious and would require stretchers to move, but Walter Pierce and 2 others appeared to be aware enough to potentially walk with assistance. But as she tried to help Walter sit up, she realized that the neural implants had done more than just extract information from his brain. They had also impaired his motor functions and speech capacity. He could understand what was happening around him, but he couldn't coordinate his movements or communicate effectively. "Walter, I'm Officer Samantha Reeves with the Lincoln County Police Department. We're here to get you out of this place. Can you understand me?" Walter's eyes focused on her face, and he nodded slightly. But when he tried to speak, only incoherent sounds emerged. The implant had apparently damaged the areas of his brain responsible for language processing. "Officer Reeves," Dr. Harrison called from the computer terminal, "I'm having trouble overriding the sterilization protocol. The system is more sophisticated than I thought, and they've got some kind of quantum encryption that I've never seen before." "How long do we have?" "Maybe 8 minutes before the neural interfaces start overloading." Samantha made a decision that went against all her training and instincts. Instead of waiting for the tactical team to secure the building, she began moving the conscious subjects toward what appeared to be an emergency exit at the far end of the laboratory. The first subject she tried to help was a woman in her 70s who appeared to be more mobile than Walter. But as soon as Samantha touched her arm, the woman began screaming. Not words, but sounds of pure terror that suggested her mind had been damaged beyond repair by whatever procedures had been performed on her. The second subject, an elderly man who appeared to be catatonic, showed no response at all when she tried to move him. His neural implant was still displaying activity on the monitors, but there was no sign that any recognizable personality remained in his damaged brain. Walter Pierce seemed to be the only subject who retained enough cognitive function to potentially cooperate with a rescue effort, but even he required extensive assistance to stand and walk. "Dr. Harrison, what did you do to these people?" "The neural interface technology was designed to extract specific memories without damaging other brain functions," he replied, while continuing to work frantically at the computer terminal. "But the people running this operation pushed the extraction process beyond safe limits. They weren't just copying information, they were essentially strip mining these people's brains for every fragment of knowledge they contained." "And the subjects who died?" "The extraction process was so intensive that their brains couldn't handle the stress. But even after death, the neural interfaces could continue accessing residual electrical activity for several hours, allowing them to recover additional information from dying brain tissue." Samantha felt sick as she realized the full scope of what had been done at this facility. The operators hadn't just been conducting illegal human experiments. They had been systematically destroying human minds to extract classified information, treating elderly researchers like disposable resources to be consumed and discarded. The sound of boots in the corridor outside the laboratory indicated that the tactical team was finally approaching their location, but it also meant that the operatives running the facility would be even more motivated to eliminate evidence of their activities. "Dr. Harrison, we're out of time. Whatever you're going to do with that computer system, do it now." "I'm trying, but the encryption is adapting faster than I can crack it. It's like the system is learning from my attempts and generating new security protocols in real time." The laboratory door burst open as federal agents in tactical gear entered with weapons raised. Agent Morrison was among them, his face grim as he surveyed the scene of medical horror. "Officer Reeves, are you injured?" "Negative, but we have a problem. These subjects have neural implants that are set to overload in about 5 minutes. If we can't disable the sterilization protocol, they're all going to die." Agent Morrison immediately began coordinating with technical specialists who had accompanied the tactical team. Within minutes, they had additional personnel working on the computer systems, while medical technicians tried to stabilize the subjects for emergency transport. But as they worked against the countdown to the sterilization protocol, Samantha noticed something that made her realize their rescue effort might already be too late. Tiffany Martinez and the other operatives who had been running the facility were nowhere to be found. Despite the tactical team's assault on the building, the key personnel had somehow managed to escape, taking with them whatever information they had extracted from their victims. "Agent Morrison," she called out, "where are the primary suspects? Did the tactical team apprehend anyone?" "We found several security personnel and support staff, but none of the medical or research personnel who were actually running the operation. It looks like they evacuated through some kind of underground tunnel system before we breached the main building." The implications were devastating. Not only had the operators escaped with classified information extracted from the minds of elderly researchers, but they had also left behind a facility full of victims who were programmed to die in order to eliminate evidence of the crimes that had been committed. "Agent Morrison, we found something," one of the technical specialists called out. "The sterilization protocol isn't just designed to kill the subjects. It's also set to destroy all the computer systems and research data. They're planning to eliminate every trace of what was done here." "How long do we have?" 3 minutes until the neural implants overload, maybe 6 minutes until the facility's self-destruct system activates. Agent Morrison began coordinating an immediate evacuation of all personnel and subjects. But Samantha realized that even if they managed to get everyone out alive, they would lose any chance of understanding what had been done or recovering the stolen information. "Dr. Harrison," she called out, "is there any way to preserve the research data before the systems destroy themselves?" "I can try to download the extraction logs, but there's no way to get all of it. The database is enormous. We're talking about decades of classified research from dozens of subjects. Do what you can." As federal agents and medical personnel worked frantically to evacuate the subjects from the laboratory, Samantha stayed with Walter Pierce, trying to provide some comfort to a man whose mind had been systematically destroyed by people who viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a data storage system to be exploited. Walter looked at her with eyes that still showed intelligence and awareness, but when he tried to communicate, the damage to his brain made coherent speech impossible. He seemed to understand that they were trying to help him, but there was also a profound sadness in his expression that suggested he knew he would never fully recover from what had been done to him. The countdown reached 0 at 4:47 p.m. Instead of the massive electrical overload that Dr. Harrison had predicted, there was only a series of small sparks from the neural implants as their power systems simply shut down. The sterilization protocol had malfunctioned, leaving the subjects alive, but the computer systems locked in an encrypted state that made data recovery impossible. As they carried Walter Pierce and the other survivors out of the facility, Samantha could see smoke rising from other buildings in the complex. The self-destruct system was working properly, even if the subject elimination protocol had failed, ensuring that any evidence of the operation would be destroyed within minutes. The last thing she saw as they reached the emergency vehicles waiting outside was the main laboratory building collapsing in on itself, taking with it any hope of understanding the full scope of what had been done to Walter Pierce and the other victims. 3 weeks later, Samantha visited Walter at the specialized medical facility where he was receiving treatment for his brain injuries. The neural implant had been successfully removed, but the damage it had caused appeared to be permanent. He could understand simple communication and perform basic tasks, but his capacity for complex thought and speech had been irreversibly compromised. "The other subjects aren't doing as well," Dr. Patricia Williams, the neurologist overseeing his care, had told her. "Most of them suffered more extensive brain damage and will require permanent institutional care. Walter was lucky, if you can call it that." "What about the people who did this? Any leads on where they went?" "The FBI is still investigating, but they've essentially vanished. The identities they were using were all sophisticated fakes, and the financial trail leads to offshore accounts that were closed immediately after the facility was destroyed." Samantha sat with Walter for an hour, reading to him from a paperback novel she'd found in his room at Sunset Manor. He seemed to enjoy the familiar routine, even if he couldn't follow the complex plot anymore. But as she was preparing to leave, Walter managed to speak a single word clearly enough for her to understand. "More." "More what, Walter?" He pointed toward the window, then gestured vaguely in several directions, repeating the word with obvious effort. "More. More." It took Samantha several minutes to understand what he was trying to communicate, but eventually she realized that Walter was warning her about something the medical professionals had missed. He was trying to tell her that there were more facilities like Hartwell Research Institute, more operations extracting classified information from elderly researchers, and more victims suffering the same fate that had been inflicted on him. The case of Walter Pierce's disappearance had been officially closed with the destruction of the facility and the rescue of the surviving subjects. But as Samantha drove away from the medical center, she understood that they had only uncovered a small piece of a much larger operation that continued to function in the shadows. Somewhere, Tiffany Martinez and her associates were setting up new facilities and identifying new targets, systematically acquiring the classified knowledge that existed only in the minds of elderly researchers who had thought their secrets died with their careers. And until someone found a way to stop them, Walter Pierce's suffering would be repeated again and again, as the accumulated knowledge of decades of classified research was extracted from the minds of people who had never intended to share their secrets with anyone. The question that would haunt Samantha for years to come was whether law enforcement would ever be able to match the resources and sophistication of an organization that could make people disappear from secured facilities and extract information directly from their brains, using technology that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to the real world. Walter Pierce had survived, but his mind had been stripped of everything that made him who he was. And somewhere in the vast network of information brokers and criminal organizations that existed beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement, the stolen contents of his memory were being analyzed, cataloged, and potentially used for purposes that the original researchers had never intended. The missing persons case had been solved, but the larger questions it raised about the security of classified information and the vulnerability of elderly researchers would remain unanswered, hidden in the same shadows that concealed the people responsible for Walter's ordeal. Some secrets, Samantha had learned, were valuable enough that people would commit unspeakable crimes to obtain them. And some victims would never fully recover from the process of having their minds systematically dismantled by people who viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a storage medium to be exploited. The nightmare that had begun with an empty bed at Sunset Manor had ended, but the larger horror it represented continued somewhere beyond the reach of justice. Officer Ashley Martinez had worked enough teenage party cases to know that most of them followed predictable patterns. Parents go out of town, word spreads through social media, 50 kids show up where only 10 were invited. Someone calls the police about noise, and everyone scatters when the patrol cars arrive. Usually, the worst consequences were some broken furniture and embarrassed parents dealing with underage drinking citations. But the party at 1847 Hillcrest Avenue in suburban Phoenix, Arizona was different from the moment Ashley arrived on scene. The house belonged to the Hendricks family, affluent suburbanites who had left their 17-year-old daughter Chelsea home alone while they attended a business conference in Chicago. What should have been a quiet weekend had turned into something much more complicated when Chelsea decided to throw what her friends later described as an intimate gathering that somehow ballooned into a full-scale house party with over 100 attendees. The call had come in at 2:17 a.m. from a neighbor complaining about loud music and cars parked throughout the residential street. Ashley had responded, expecting a routine noise complaint, but what she found when she arrived suggested that something had gone seriously wrong during the evening's festivities. The house was empty except for 3 teenagers who appeared to be passed out on various pieces of furniture in the living room. Empty alcohol bottles and red plastic cups littered every surface, and there were clear signs that the party had gotten significantly out of hand. Broken decorations, overturned furniture, and what appeared to be vomit stains on the carpet. But Chelsea Hendricks was nowhere to be found. Ashley's attempts to wake the 3 unconscious teenagers initially met with limited success. 2 of them, a boy and girl who appeared to be around 16, were so intoxicated that they couldn't provide coherent information about what had happened during the party or where Chelsea might be. The 3rd teenager, a 17-year-old named Brandon Walsh, was slightly more responsive but seemed disoriented and confused about basic facts. "Where's Chelsea?" Ashley asked as Brandon slowly regained consciousness on the living room couch. "Chelsea? I don't know. She was here earlier. We were all hanging out, having a good time." Brandon's speech was slurred and his eyes had difficulty focusing on Ashley's face. "When did you last see her?" "I don't remember. Everything's kind of blurry after maybe midnight. There were a lot of people here." Ashley checked the rest of the house, finding evidence that the party had extended to every room, including the bedrooms upstairs. Chelsea's parents' bedroom had been thoroughly ransacked, with jewelry and personal items scattered across the floor. Several windows were open and the back door was unlocked, suggesting that people had been coming and going freely throughout the evening. But it was what Ashley found in Chelsea's bedroom that first suggested this wasn't just a case of a teenage girl who had passed out somewhere or gone home with friends. The room looked like it had been searched by someone looking for something specific. Dresser drawers had been pulled out and their contents dumped on the floor. The closet had been emptied, and even the mattress had been pulled off the bed frame. Personal items that should have been important to a teenage girl, photographs, jewelry, electronics, were scattered carelessly around the room as if whoever had been searching wasn't interested in typical valuables. Ashley called for backup and began documenting the scene while trying to get more coherent information from the three unconscious teenagers. As they gradually sobered up, a disturbing picture began to emerge of a party that had started normally, but had taken several concerning turns as the evening progressed. "There were people here I didn't recognize," Brandon said as his memory began to clear. "Chelsea invited maybe 20 people, but word got out on social media and all these random people started showing up. Some of them were way older, like college age, or even older than that." "Did Chelsea know these older people?" "I don't think so. She seemed kind of uncomfortable when they started arriving, but she didn't want to be rude and ask them to leave. You know how Chelsea is. She always tries to be nice to everyone." Ashley was taking notes while coordinating with the backup officers who had arrived to help process the scene. The other two teenagers were slowly becoming coherent enough to provide additional information about the party's progression. Amber Rodriguez, 16, had been Chelsea's best friend since middle school and had helped plan the original small gathering. Her account of the evening was fragmented, but suggested that the party had taken an unexpectedly dark turn sometime after midnight. "People kept arriving who none of us knew," Amber said, holding an ice pack to her head and looking nauseated. "And they weren't just college kids looking for a party. Some of them were really creepy, asking weird questions about Chelsea's parents and what they did for work." "What kind of questions?" "Like, where they worked, how much money they made, whether they traveled a lot for business. At first we thought they were just making conversation, but then they started asking about security systems and whether the family had expensive stuff worth stealing." The third teenager, Matthew Kim, had arrived at the party around 10 p.m. and had a clearer memory of the early evening events. His account suggested that the party had been deliberately targeted by people with specific intentions beyond just crashing a teenage house party. "There was this group of older guys who showed up around 11, Matthew said. "They had their own alcohol and were offering people drinks, but the drinks were really strong, like stronger than normal beer or whatever. People started getting way more messed up than they should have been." Ashley felt alarm bells going off in her head. "Matthew, are you saying you think people's drinks were spiked with something?" "I don't know for sure, but yeah, maybe. I saw Chelsea talking to one of these guys for like 20 minutes, and she seemed fine, but then after she had one of their drinks, she got really out of it really fast." "Can you describe these older men?" "There were 3 or 4 of them. The main guy was maybe in his 30s, well-dressed, like he had money. He seemed to know a lot about Chelsea's family, knew her parents' names, knew they were out of town, knew about her dad's job. It was weird how much he knew." Ashley was already calling for detectives and a crime scene team. What had initially appeared to be a routine teenage party situation was beginning to look like something much more sinister, possibly a targeted operation that had used the house party as cover for criminal activity. Matthew, did you see Chelsea leave with anyone? Or see her go anywhere specific in the house? That's the weird part. I remember seeing her talking to that guy upstairs around midnight, and she seemed really upset about something. But after that, I don't remember seeing her at all. And I was here until you guys showed up. By 4 a.m., Detective Ryan Murphy had arrived to take over the investigation, along with a team of crime scene technicians who began processing the house for evidence. What they found supported the teenagers' accounts of a party that had been infiltrated and possibly orchestrated by people with criminal intentions. The most disturbing discovery came when technicians tested the alcohol containers left behind by the uninvited guests. Several bottles contained traces of Rohypnol and GHB, drugs commonly associated with sexual assault cases, in concentrations that could have rendered someone unconscious within minutes of consumption. We're dealing with predators who specifically targeted this party, Detective Murphy told Ashley as they reviewed the preliminary findings. They knew the family would be out of town, they knew Chelsea would be home alone, and they came prepared with drugs and a plan. What about Chelsea? Any sign of where they might have taken her? We're checking traffic cameras and canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses, but the timing suggests they had several hours to get her away from the area before anyone realized she was missing. The breakthrough came when crime scene technicians found something in the backyard that the initial search had missed. Hidden in the bushes near the back gate was Chelsea's cell phone, but it wasn't just discarded casually. The phone had been deliberately dismantled, the battery removed, the SIM card taken out, and the internal components damaged as if someone had tried to prevent it from being tracked or providing location data. "This is professional behavior," Detective Murphy said, examining the destroyed phone. "Most criminals don't know enough about cell phone tracking to disable a device this thoroughly. We're dealing with people who understand surveillance technology and counter-surveillance techniques." Ashley was reviewing the notes she'd taken from interviewing the 3 teenagers when she noticed something that had been bothering her since she first arrived on scene. "Detective Murphy, I keep thinking about how the bedrooms were searched. If this was just a sexual assault case or even a kidnapping for ransom, why would they tear Chelsea's room apart like they were looking for something specific?" "What do you mean?" "The way her room was ransacked. It wasn't random vandalism or someone looking for valuables to steal. It was systematic, like they were searching for specific documents or information." And Matthew said the older men were asking detailed questions about her parents' work and finances. Detective Murphy considered this observation. "You think this might be connected to the parents rather than targeting Chelsea specifically?" "I think we need to find out a lot more about what Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks do for a living." The call to Chelsea's parents in Chicago revealed information that transformed the investigation from a teenage party gone wrong into something that resembled industrial espionage or organized crime. Robert Hendricks worked as a senior engineer for a defense contractor that developed classified technology for the military. His wife, Jennifer, was a financial consultant who specialized in managing assets for high-net-worth individuals, including several clients who preferred to keep their business dealings private. "Officer Martinez," Jennifer Hendricks said during the phone call, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. "Are you telling me that someone targeted our daughter to get information about our work?" "We're still investigating, Mrs. Hendricks. But the evidence suggests that the people who infiltrated the party were specifically interested in your family's background and may have taken Chelsea to use as leverage against you or your husband." "This is insane. We're just normal people trying to make a living. Why would anyone want to hurt Chelsea to get to us?" But as Ashley continued the conversation with Chelsea's parents, it became clear that their normal life included access to information and resources that certain people might consider extremely valuable. Robert's security clearance gave him access to cutting-edge military technology, while Jennifer's client list included individuals who had reason to keep their financial activities away from government scrutiny. "Mrs. Hendricks, I need you and your husband to return to Phoenix immediately, and I need you to think very carefully about anyone who might have shown unusual interest in your work or family situation recently." There was something," Jennifer said hesitantly. "About a month ago, Robert mentioned that someone had been asking questions about him at work. Not official questions, but like someone was trying to get information about his projects and security clearance." "What kind of someone?" "He said it was presented as a background check for some kind of consulting opportunity, but the questions were more detailed than normal. They wanted to know about our finances, our travel schedule, our family situation. Robert thought it was suspicious enough to report it to his security officer." Ashley felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The party hadn't been a random target of opportunity. It had been part of a carefully planned operation to gain access to the Hendricks family and the information they possessed. But Chelsea's disappearance was just the beginning. As Ashley and Detective Murphy continued their investigation, they would discover that the teenage girl had been caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than a house party gone wrong. Somewhere in Phoenix, possibly in a location that had been prepared specifically for this purpose, Chelsea Hendricks was being held by people who viewed her not as a person, but as a tool to be used against her parents in pursuit of information that could be worth millions of dollars on the black market. And with every hour that passed, the chances of finding her alive grew smaller as the people who had taken her moved closer to achieving their ultimate objective: accessing classified military technology and private financial information that could be used to cause damage on a national scale. The 3 teenagers who had survived the party at 1847 Hillcrest Avenue were released to their parents after spending 6 hours at the police station, but Detective Murphy insisted they remain available for follow-up interviews as the investigation developed. What none of them realized as they left the station that morning was how dramatically their stories would change over the following days. Officer Ashley Martinez had been assigned to conduct the follow-up interviews, and she began with Brandon Walsh, the 17-year-old who had seemed most coherent during the initial questioning. When she met with Brandon and his parents at their home 2 days after the party, she found a young man who appeared to be struggling with memory problems that went beyond normal alcohol-induced blackouts. "Brandon, I'd like to go through the events of Saturday night again, now that you've had time to recover," Ashley said, sitting across from him in his family's living room while his parents listened anxiously. "I've been trying to remember," Brandon said, rubbing his temples as if fighting a headache. "But it's like there are pieces missing, not just fuzzy, but actually missing, like someone took parts of my memory and deleted them." "What's the last thing you remember clearly?" Chelsea introducing me to some of the older guys who crashed the party. One of them seemed really interested in talking to me, asking about school, my plans after graduation, that kind of thing. He seemed nice enough, but there was something weird about how much attention he was paying to me. Ashley made notes while encouraging Brandon to continue. "Can you describe this man?" "Tall, maybe 6'2", dark hair, well-dressed. He looked like he had money, you know. Expensive watch, nice shoes. But the weird thing was how much he seemed to know about everyone at the party. He knew names. He knew which school people went to. He even knew stuff about some people's families." "What happened after you talked to him?" "That's where it gets strange. I remember him offering me a drink, and I remember taking it. But after that..." Brandon paused, his expression troubled. "After that, there's nothing until I woke up on Chelsea's couch when you arrived." Brandon's parents, who had remained silent during most of the interview, exchanged worried glances. His mother, Patricia Walsh, finally spoke up. "Officer Martinez, Brandon's been having nightmares since the party, really intense ones where he wakes up screaming about things that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" "He keeps talking about being in a room with bright lights and people asking him questions he couldn't understand. But He says it felt real, not like a dream. Ashley felt a chill as she realized the implications of what she was hearing. Brandon, in these dreams, can you remember any of the questions they were asking you? They wanted to know about my parents, about our house, about my dad's work schedule, but also weird stuff, like whether I'd ever been hypnotized, whether I had any allergies, whether I'd ever had surgery. Brandon's voice became strained as he tried to access the memories. The whole thing felt like some kind of medical examination, but that's impossible because I was at Chelsea's house the whole time. Are you sure you were at Chelsea's house the whole time? Brandon stared at her for a long moment, his face pale. I don't know. I thought I was, but now that you ask, I can't actually remember being in any specific room at Chelsea's house after about midnight. The interview with Amber Rodriguez yielded even more disturbing information. Chelsea's best friend had been dealing with similar memory gaps and nightmares, but her recollections included details that suggested something had happened to her that went far beyond simply drinking too much at a party. I keep having these flashes of being somewhere else, Amber told Ashley as they sat in a quiet corner of the coffee shop where Amber worked part-time. Not Chelsea's house, but somewhere with concrete walls and medical equipment. Medical equipment? Like in a hospital or a doctor's office. I remember being on some kind of table with bright lights overhead and people in masks standing around me. But that's impossible, right? I was at Chelsea's party the whole time. Ashley studied Amber's face carefully, noting the genuine confusion and distress in her expression. Amber, these memories you're having, do they feel like dreams, or do they feel real? That's the problem. They feel completely real. More real than my memories of being at the party, actually. I can remember specific details, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of machines beeping, even conversations between the people who were doing things to me. What kind of things? Amber's voice dropped to almost a whisper. They were asking me questions while I was on this table. Personal questions about Chelsea's family, about her parents' work, about the layout of their house. But I was answering them even though I didn't want to, like I couldn't control what I was saying. Ashley felt a growing sense of unease as she realized what Amber might be describing. Did they give you any kind of injection or medication? I think so. I remember a sharp pain in my arm, and then everything became really fuzzy. But I could still hear everything they were saying, and I could still answer their questions. I just couldn't control my responses. The implications were deeply disturbing. If Amber's account was accurate, it suggested that the teenagers at the party hadn't just been drugged and left unconscious. They had been systematically interrogated using pharmaceutical methods designed to extract information against their will. Amber, I need you to think very carefully about this next question. In these memories, did you see Chelsea? Was she there with you? Amber closed her eyes and concentrated for several minutes before responding. Yes, she was on another table next to mine. But she wasn't answering questions like I was. They were doing something different to her. Different how? She was connected to some kind of machine, and they seemed to be, I don't know how to describe it, like they were putting information into her head instead of taking it out. And she looked terrified, but she couldn't move or speak. Ashley's interview with Matthew Kim, the third teenager who had been conscious when she arrived at the party, provided the most coherent account of what had actually happened that night. Unlike Brandon and Amber, Matthew's memories were relatively clear, but what he described painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal operation that had used the house party as cover for something far more sinister than simple kidnapping. I remember more than the other two because I didn't drink as much, Matthew explained as they sat in his family's living room. I was the designated driver, so I was trying to stay relatively sober. That's probably why whatever they put in the drinks didn't affect me as much. Tell me about these older men who crashed the party. There were 4 of them, and they definitely weren't there to party. They moved through the house like they were conducting some kind of operation. One of them was asking people questions and getting them to drink from specific bottles. Another one was taking photographs of everything. The house, the people, even family photos on the walls. What happened to the people who drank from those specific bottles? They got really messed up really fast, but not in a normal drunk way, more like they were in some kind of trance. They could walk and talk, but they seemed to be following instructions from the older guys without really thinking about it. Ashley made careful notes as Matthew continued his account. Did you see what happened to Chelsea specifically? Around midnight, one of the older guys, the one who seemed to be in charge, took Chelsea upstairs. She was already pretty out of it from whatever was in that drink. About 20 minutes later, they both came back downstairs, but Chelsea looked completely different. Different how? Like she wasn't really there anymore. Her eyes were open and she was walking around, but it was like someone else was controlling her body. She wasn't responding to her friends, wasn't acting like herself at all. Matthew's description matched what Ashley had observed on the security footage from other cases involving sophisticated criminal organizations, victims who appeared to be conscious but were actually under some form of pharmaceutical or psychological control. Matthew, did you see Chelsea leave the house? That's the weird part. Around 1 a.m., she just walked out the back door like she was going somewhere specific. But she didn't take her purse or her keys or anything, just walked out into the backyard and disappeared. Did anyone go with her? Not right away, but about 10 minutes later, two of the older guys left through the same door. They weren't hurrying or acting suspicious, just casually walking out like they were going to their car. Ashley was beginning to understand the sophisticated nature of the operation that had targeted Chelsea and her friends. The perpetrators had used advanced pharmaceutical methods to control their victims' behavior, systematically extracted information about the Hendricks family, and then used some form of behavioral programming to make Chelsea voluntarily leave the house and go to a predetermined location. Matthew, during the time you were observing all this, did any of the older men show particular interest in you or try to get you to drink anything specific? One of them kept offering me drinks, but when I told him I was driving, he seemed to lose interest in me. It was like once he realized I wasn't going to be as easily affected, he just ignored me. Did you overhear any conversations between these men? Some of it. They were talking about timelines and logistics, like they were coordinating some kind of business operation. I heard one of them say something about extraction protocols and information verification. It sounded really professional, like they'd done this kind of thing before. The picture that emerged from the 3 interviews was deeply disturbing. The house party had been infiltrated by a team of professional criminals who had used sophisticated methods to drug and interrogate teenagers in order to extract information about Chelsea's family. Then they had used some form of behavioral control to make Chelsea voluntarily accompany them to a secondary location. But there were still crucial questions that remained unanswered. Where had they taken Chelsea? What did they ultimately want from her parents? And how had they acquired the advanced pharmaceutical and psychological techniques they had used on the party attendees? Detective Murphy was coordinating with federal agencies to investigate the sophisticated nature of the operation, but Ashley was focused on a more immediate concern. If the perpetrators had been able to control Chelsea's behavior to the extent that Matthew described, they might still be using her as an unwilling asset in whatever larger plan they were executing. Detective Murphy, Ashley said, as they reviewed the interview notes, I think we need to consider the possibility that Chelsea isn't just a kidnapping victim. Based on what Matthew observed, she may have been programmed to cooperate with her captors in some way. You mean like brainwashing? Something like that, but more sophisticated. The pharmaceutical methods they used on the other teenagers, combined with whatever they did to Chelsea upstairs, might have been designed to make her a compliant participant in whatever they're planning. The implications were frightening. If Chelsea was being used as an unwilling accomplice in a scheme to extract classified information from her parents, traditional rescue methods might not be effective. They would need to understand the psychological conditioning she had been subjected to in order to safely extract her from the situation. But first, they had to find her. And with each passing hour, the chances of locating her before the perpetrators achieved their ultimate objective grew smaller. As Ashley continued her investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house party had been just the first phase of a larger operation that was still unfolding. Somewhere in Lincoln County, Chelsea Hendricks was being held by people who had turned her into a weapon against her own family, using advanced techniques that blurred the line between kidnapping and mind control. The question that haunted Ashley was whether they would be able to find Chelsea before her captors used her to destroy everything her parents had worked to build, and whether the young woman they eventually rescued would still be recognizable as the person she had been before that terrible night. The abandoned warehouse on Industrial Boulevard had been empty for 3 years, another casualty of Phoenix's shifting manufacturing sector. But Officer Ashley Martinez discovered that appearances could be deceiving when she followed up on an anonymous tip about unusual activity at the facility. The tip had come through the department's confidential hotline at 3 a.m. on Thursday morning, exactly 4 days after Chelsea Hendricks's disappearance. The caller, who identified himself only as someone who knows what happened at that party, provided specific details about vehicles being seen at the warehouse during late-night hours, and mentioned seeing a teenage girl who matched Chelsea's description. Ashley had wanted to coordinate the warehouse investigation with Detective Murphy and federal agents, but the caller had been insistent that law enforcement presence would cause the perpetrators to relocate their operation immediately. Against her better judgment, she decided to conduct initial reconnaissance alone, planning to call for backup once she had confirmed whether the location was actually connected to Chelsea's case. The warehouse district was deserted at 4 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, with most of the remaining businesses having closed hours earlier. Ashley parked her patrol car a quarter-mile away and approached the target facility on foot, using abandoned buildings and shipping containers as cover, while she observed the exterior of the warehouse. At first glance, the building appeared to be completely vacant. The parking lot was empty, windows were boarded up, and weeds had grown up around the loading docks. But as Ashley watched from her concealed position, she began to notice subtle signs that suggested the facility was not as abandoned as it appeared. The chain-link fence surrounding the property was in better repair than expected for a building that had been empty for 3 years. Several of the security cameras mounted on light poles appeared to be active, their red recording lights blinking steadily. Most telling of all, there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt near a side entrance that suggested regular vehicle traffic. Ashley was preparing to call Detective Murphy when she observed something that made her realize the investigation had taken a dangerous turn. A black SUV pulled into the warehouse parking lot and stopped near the main entrance. 3 people got out, 2 men in business suits and a teenage girl who appeared to be moving in the same controlled, trance-like manner that Matthew Kim had described observing in Chelsea at the house party. Even from a distance, Ashley could see that the girl matched Chelsea's physical description. But her behavior was deeply unsettling. She walked with mechanical precision, showed no awareness of her surroundings, and followed the 2 men's instructions with the blank compliance of someone whose will had been completely overridden. Ashley immediately called for backup while maintaining visual surveillance of the warehouse. But as she waited for additional units to arrive, she witnessed something that convinced her that waiting for backup might not be an option. One of the men who had arrived with Chelsea made a phone call, and within minutes, several other vehicles began arriving at the warehouse. What had appeared to be an abandoned building suddenly became a hub of activity as people in medical scrubs and business attire began moving equipment and documents out of the facility. They were evacuating. Ashley realized that if she waited for backup to arrive, Chelsea and any evidence of what had been done to her would disappear. The perpetrators had clearly been monitoring law enforcement communications, or had been warned by their source within the police department that their location had been compromised. Making a decision that would haunt her for months afterward, Ashley approached the warehouse alone, hoping to gather enough intelligence to prevent the complete loss of their only lead in Chelsea's case. The side entrance she had observed was secured with a heavy padlock, but the loading dock on the opposite side of the building had been left open to accommodate the evacuation activity. Ashley was able to enter the warehouse through the loading area, taking cover behind stacks of shipping pallets while she observed the operation that was unfolding inside. What she saw inside the warehouse challenged everything she thought she knew about the scope and sophistication of the criminal organization they were dealing with. The interior of the building had been converted into what appeared to be a combination medical facility and high-tech laboratory. Multiple rooms had been constructed within the larger warehouse space, each equipped with examination tables, monitoring equipment, and computer systems that looked more advanced than anything she had seen in hospitals. But it was the scale of the operation that was most shocking. Ashley counted at least 20 people moving through the facility with the efficiency and organization of a legitimate business operation. They weren't behaving like criminals trying to cover their tracks. They were behaving like professionals executing a planned relocation. Chelsea was in a room near the center of the facility, seated in what appeared to be a modified dentist's chair with various electronic devices connected to her head. Unlike the completely blank expression Matthew had described, she now appeared to be actively engaged in conversation with someone Ashley couldn't see from her position. But there was something deeply wrong with Chelsea's side of the conversation. Her responses were too quick, too precise, and completely lacking in the personality and speech patterns that should have been natural for a 17-year-old girl. She sounded like someone reciting scripted answers to predetermined questions. Ashley managed to move closer to Chelsea's location by using the confusion of the evacuation as cover. What she overheard of the conversation confirmed her worst fears about what had been done to the missing teenager. "Confirm your father's current security clearance level," a male voice instructed. "Robert Hendricks maintains top-secret clearance with compartmentalized information access through his position at Advanced Defense Systems," Chelsea replied in a monotone voice. "His current projects include development of adaptive camouflage technology and battlefield communication encryption systems. Provide access codes for his home computer system." Chelsea recited a series of alphanumeric codes without hesitation, followed by detailed instructions for bypassing additional security measures that her father had implemented to protect his work materials. "Confirm your mother's client list for offshore financial management." Again, Chelsea provided detailed information without any sign of emotional distress or resistance. She had been turned into a human database, programmed to provide unlimited access to her family's most sensitive information. Ashley was preparing to call for immediate tactical backup when she heard footsteps approaching her position. She turned to find herself facing one of the men she had seen arriving with Chelsea, tall, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. "Officer Martinez," he said calmly, "I was wondering when you'd arrive. We've been monitoring police communications, and we knew someone would eventually trace our operation to this location." Ashley reached for her service weapon, but the man held up his hand in a non-threatening gesture. "There's no need for violence," he continued. "In fact, I'd like to offer you the same opportunity we've provided to Chelsea, the chance to be part of something much larger and more important than local law enforcement." "You mean the chance to be brainwashed into a compliant asset?" The man smiled. Such a crude way to describe advanced behavioral modification technology. "What we've done with Chelsea isn't brainwashing. It's optimization. We've simply removed the psychological barriers that prevented her from reaching her full potential as an information resource." Ashley felt a chill as she realized the full scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a group that viewed human consciousness as technology to be hacked and reprogrammed according to their needs. "Who are you people? What do you want with Chelsea's family?" "We're researchers, Officer Martinez. We study human behavior and develop methods for optimizing cognitive function." Chelsea's parents possess information that could advance our research by decades, but they've been reluctant to share it voluntarily. So you decided to turn their daughter into a weapon against them. We decided to help Chelsea overcome the arbitrary limitations that society had placed on her potential. She's now capable of accessing and processing information at levels that would have been impossible before her optimization. Ashley was stalling for time while trying to figure out how to extract Chelsea from the facility without getting them both killed. But as the man continued talking, she realized that the situation was even more desperate than she had initially understood. Officer Martinez, I should mention that Chelsea isn't our only success story. Over the past 18 months, we've optimized several dozen subjects from various backgrounds. Some were teenagers like Chelsea. Others were adults with access to valuable information or resources. You're talking about a network of mind-controlled assets. We prefer the term cognitively enhanced individuals. And yes, we've developed quite an extensive network. In fact, I believe you've already met some of our other success stories during your investigation. Ashley felt her blood run cold as the implications of his statement became clear. You're saying some of the people I've been working with have been compromised. Let's just say that your investigation has proceeded exactly as we intended it to. Every lead you've followed, every witness you've interviewed, every piece of evidence you've discovered. It's all been carefully orchestrated to bring you to this moment. The warehouse suddenly felt like a trap that had been closing around her for days without her realizing it. How many of the people involved in Chelsea's case had been feeding information to this organization? How much of what she thought she knew about the investigation had been deliberately manipulated? What do you want from me? The same thing we've given Chelsea, the opportunity to transcend the limitations of normal human consciousness. You have skills and access that could be valuable to our research, and we'd like to offer you the chance to join our network voluntarily. And if I refuse? The man's expression didn't change, but his tone became slightly colder. Then you'll join our network involuntarily. The optimization process works equally well either way, though voluntary subjects tend to adapt more quickly to their enhanced capabilities. Ashley was reaching for her radio to call for backup when she heard the sound of vehicles approaching the warehouse at high speed. Through the windows, she could see police cars and federal tactical units surrounding the building. But instead of looking concerned about the law enforcement response, the man seemed pleased. "Excellent timing," he said. "This will be a perfect demonstration of how effectively our network has penetrated local and federal law enforcement agencies." As Ashley watched in horror, some of the responding officers began taking positions that would prevent the escape of their fellow officers rather than the suspects. The tactical operation that should have been a rescue mission was being sabotaged from within by people who appeared to be legitimate law enforcement personnel. The investigation into Chelsea Hendricks's disappearance had led Ashley into a nightmare scenario where she couldn't trust her colleagues, couldn't rely on backup, and couldn't be sure which of her own memories and perceptions had been manipulated by an organization that treated human consciousness like software to be hacked and reprogrammed. And somewhere in the chaos of the compromised rescue operation, Chelsea continued to sit in her modified chair, providing detailed information about her family's secrets to people who viewed her not as a victim to be saved, but as a successfully reprogrammed asset to be protected and utilized. The tactical operation at the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard collapsed into chaos within minutes of its initiation. Officer Ashley Martinez watched from her position inside the facility as the law enforcement response fractured along lines that had been invisible until this moment. Lines between officers who were genuinely trying to rescue Chelsea Hendricks and those who had been compromised by the organization they were supposed to be fighting. The first sign of sabotage came when Detective Murphy's voice crackled over the radio with orders that made no tactical sense. Instead of establishing a perimeter to prevent escape, units were being directed to positions that would allow the warehouse personnel to evacuate through predetermined routes. All units, establish containment positions at grid references Alpha 7 through Delta 3. Murphy's voice instructed. Do not approach the primary structure until federal assets have secured the interior. But Ashley could see through the warehouse windows that there were no federal assets approaching the building. The tactical units that should have been moving to secure Chelsea and apprehend her captors were instead taking defensive positions that protected the evacuation operation. Officer Martinez, the well-dressed man said, seeming to enjoy her realization that the rescue operation had been compromised from the beginning. I think you're beginning to understand the scope of what you're dealing with. This isn't just about Chelsea or her family. It's about a fundamental shift in how human resources can be managed and optimized. Ashley was trapped between wanting to maintain her position to protect Chelsea and needing to alert someone, anyone, in law enforcement who hadn't been compromised. But as she listened to the radio traffic coordinating the tactical response, she began to suspect that the infiltration was more extensive than she had imagined. How many? She asked. How many what, Officer Martinez? How many people in law enforcement are working for you? The man consulted a tablet device. In Lincoln County specifically? About 30% of sworn personnel, plus key positions in dispatch and administration. Nationally, we've achieved significant penetration in most major departments and federal agencies. The numbers were staggering. If he was telling the truth, the organization had effectively taken control of law enforcement response capabilities in multiple jurisdictions, making traditional police work ineffective against their operations. What's your end game? What do you actually want? Information, Officer Martinez. Human knowledge is the most valuable commodity in the modern world, but it's locked away in individual minds that are inefficient, unreliable, and resistant to sharing. We've developed methods to unlock that information and make it available for optimization. As if to demonstrate his point, he gestured toward Chelsea, who continued to provide detailed information about her father's classified work in the same emotionless tone Ashley had observed earlier. Chelsea now has perfect recall of everything she's ever seen or heard related to her parents' work. She can access financial records, security protocols, personal conversations, everything. And she can share that information without the emotional barriers that would normally prevent such disclosure. You're talking about industrial espionage on a massive scale. We're talking about the next stage of human evolution. The arbitrary boundaries between individual minds are inefficient. Our methods allow for true information sharing and collective cognitive enhancement. Ashley was about to respond when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Over the radio, she could hear Detective Murphy coordinating with someone identified as Asset Command, using language and protocols that belonged to the organization, rather than legitimate law enforcement. Asset Command, this is Murphy. Target package is secure and ready for extraction. Recommend immediate relocation to secondary facility. Copy that, Murphy. Initiate cleanup protocol and prepare for full site evacuation. Ashley realized that Detective Murphy, her supervisor, the man who had been leading the investigation into Chelsea's disappearance, was actually coordinating with her captors to ensure their successful escape. The warehouse had become a trap, not for the criminals, but for any law enforcement personnel who hadn't been compromised. Ashley was probably the only genuine police officer on scene, surrounded by people who appeared to be her colleagues but were actually working for the organization that had taken Chelsea. Officer Martinez, the well-dressed man said, I think you're beginning to understand your situation. You have two choices. Join our network voluntarily and retain some measure of your original personality, or resist and be optimized through more direct methods. Ashley looked at Chelsea, trying to see some sign of the 17-year-old girl who had been excited about having a party while her parents were out of town. But there was nothing recognizable in Chelsea's expression or behavior. She had been so thoroughly reprogrammed that her original personality appeared to be completely gone. What happens to her parents when you're finished extracting information? That depends on their value as ongoing assets. Chelsea's father possesses expertise that could be useful to our research programs. Her mother's financial connections provide access to resources we need for expansion. They may be offered the opportunity to join our network. And if they refuse, then they become redundant. The casual way he discussed eliminating Chelsea's parents confirmed Ashley's worst fears about the organization's ultimate objectives. They weren't just interested in information, they were systematically replacing normal human relationships and social structures with their network of controlled assets. Ashley's radio crackled with an update that made her realize her time was running out. All units be advised that Officer Martinez appears to have entered the facility without authorization. She is to be considered compromised and potentially dangerous. Use whatever force necessary to secure her for debriefing. Her own department was now hunting her as a rogue officer, based on false information provided by people who were actually working for the organization she was trying to fight. "Officer Martinez," the man said, "I'm afraid your colleagues are no longer going to be helpful to you, but we are still prepared to offer you a place in our network. The optimization process has been refined significantly since Chelsea's treatment. You would retain much more of your original cognitive function while gaining access to enhanced capabilities." Ashley was calculating her options when she heard something that changed everything, the sound of genuine distress from Chelsea. For just a moment, something in Chelsea's voice shifted from the mechanical recitation of information to something that sounded like a frightened teenager calling for help. It was barely audible under the technical language she was reciting about her father's security protocols, but it was definitely there. "She's still in there," Ashley said. "I beg your pardon?" "Chelsea. The real Chelsea is still in there somewhere, fighting against whatever you've done to her." The man's expression shifted slightly, showing the first sign of uncertainty Ashley had seen from him. "The optimization process is completely thorough. There are no residual personality fragments that could interfere with asset function." But Ashley had heard what she had heard, and it suggested that Chelsea's original personality hadn't been completely erased, just suppressed. If there was even a small chance of reversing what had been done to her, Ashley had to try. "Chelsea!" she called out, ignoring the man's attempt to stop her from approaching. "Chelsea, it's Officer Martinez. I'm here to take you home." For a split second, Chelsea's mechanical recitation stopped. Her eyes focused on Ashley's face with what appeared to be recognition, and her mouth formed words that had nothing to do with the information extraction protocol. "Please help me." The man immediately moved to a control panel and began adjusting settings on the devices connected to Chelsea's head. "Asset malfunction," he said into a radio. "Initiating emergency stabilization protocol." But the brief moment of recognition had been enough to confirm what Ashley suspected. The organization's mind control technology wasn't perfect, and the original personalities of their victims could potentially be recovered. The warehouse was suddenly filled with the sound of real gunfire as someone outside began engaging with the compromised tactical units. Through the windows, Ashley could see muzzle flashes and smoke as a firefight erupted in the parking lot. "Officer Martinez, we need to evacuate immediately," the man said, his calm demeanor finally showing cracks. "Asset extraction is no longer possible at this location." But Ashley was already moving toward Chelsea, determined to prevent her from being relocated to another facility where the programming process might be made irreversible. As she reached the modified chair where Chelsea was restrained, she began disconnecting the electronic devices that were maintaining the behavioral control. "Don't," the man warned. "Disconnecting those devices improperly could cause permanent brain damage." "She already has permanent brain damage from what you've done to her." Ashley continued disconnecting the devices while Chelsea looked at her with increasing recognition and growing terror as she began to understand what had been done to her. "Ashley?" Chelsea whispered, her voice sounding like herself for the first time since her disappearance. "What happened to me? I can't remember. There are all these things in my head that I don't understand." The organization had filled Chelsea's mind with information and capabilities that didn't belong to her, creating a horrifying mixture of her original personality and the programmed asset they had tried to create. The gunfire outside was growing closer as the real tactical units, whoever they were, fought their way toward the warehouse. Ashley helped Chelsea out of the chair, but immediately realized that the teenager's motor functions had been severely impacted by the programming process. "I can't walk properly," Chelsea said, panic rising in her voice. "My legs don't work the way they're supposed to, and there are voices in my head telling me to go back to the chair." Ashley supported Chelsea as they moved toward what appeared to be an emergency exit, but their progress was stopped by the arrival of several people in tactical gear who definitely weren't legitimate law enforcement. "Asset recovery team," one of them announced. "Return the subject to the extraction chair immediately." Ashley drew her service weapon, but realized she was completely outgunned by people who had professional military training and equipment. The situation had become hopeless. They were trapped in a facility controlled by an organization that had unlimited resources and had compromised law enforcement response at every level. But as the asset recovery team closed in on their position, the warehouse wall exploded inward as an armored vehicle crashed through the building's exterior. Real federal agents poured through the breach, engaging with the organization's security personnel in a firefight that quickly overwhelmed the facility's defenses. In the chaos that followed, Ashley managed to get Chelsea out of the warehouse and into the custody of what appeared to be legitimate federal agents. But even as medical personnel worked to stabilize Chelsea for transport to a specialized facility, Ashley could see that the damage done to the teenager was extensive and possibly irreversible. "Officer Martinez," Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI said as they watched Chelsea being loaded into an ambulance, "We've been tracking this organization for months. What you stumbled into was just one cell of a much larger network." "What about Detective Murphy and the other compromised officers?" "Gone. They evacuated with the organization personnel before our assault team could secure the facility. We found evidence of their activities, but most of the primary suspects escaped." Ashley watched the ambulance disappear into the night, carrying a 17-year-old girl whose mind had been turned into a battlefield between her original personality and the programming that had been forced onto her. "Agent Williams, what are Chelsea's chances of recovery?" "Unknown. We've never seen this level of sophisticated behavioral modification before. The technology they used appears to be years ahead of anything we thought was possible." 6 months later, Ashley visited Chelsea at the specialized treatment facility where she was receiving experimental therapy designed to help her cope with the competing personalities and memories that existed in her mind. The progress was slow and uncertain, with some days when Chelsea seemed almost normal and others when the programmed asset personality dominated her behavior. "She remembers everything that happened during the programming process," Dr. Sarah Kim, Chelsea's psychiatrist, explained. "But she experiences those memories as if they belong to someone else. The original Chelsea is still there, but she's sharing mental space with an artificially created personality that has access to capabilities and information that terrify her." "What about her parents? How are they dealing with all this?" "They're struggling. Their daughter looks the same and sometimes acts the same, but she also has access to classified information that she shouldn't know and occasionally displays technical knowledge that's completely foreign to her original personality." Ashley spent an hour with Chelsea, reading to her from the same book series she had enjoyed before her disappearance. For most of the visit, Chelsea seemed like a normal teenager dealing with trauma and recovery. But just as Ashley was preparing to leave, something shifted in Chelsea's expression and voice. "Officer Martinez," she said in a tone that was completely different from her normal speech patterns, "I want you to know that there are 17 other active facilities conducting similar optimization procedures. The Lincoln County operation was considered a moderate success despite the eventual exposure. The programmed personality was providing information that could be valuable to law enforcement, but at the cost of traumatizing the original Chelsea, who had to experience being controlled by thoughts and knowledge that didn't belong to her." "Chelsea, are you okay?" Ashley asked. "I don't know," Chelsea replied, her voice returning to normal. Sometimes I know things that I never learned, and sometimes I say things that I never meant to say. The doctors say it might get better, but I can feel that other person in my head all the time, waiting to take control again." As Ashley left the treatment facility, she couldn't escape the feeling that Chelsea's case represented just the beginning of a much larger problem. The organization that had targeted her had demonstrated capabilities that made traditional law enforcement methods obsolete, and they had successfully disappeared after completing most of their objectives. Somewhere, other teenagers were being subjected to the same optimization process that had turned Chelsea into a living weapon against her own family. And somewhere, the people responsible for these crimes were refining their techniques and preparing to expand their network of controlled assets. The missing persons case had been solved in the sense that Chelsea had been found and rescued. But the larger questions about human autonomy, the security of individual consciousness, and the vulnerability of society to organizations that could reprogram human minds remained unanswered. Ashley continued working missing persons cases, but she never stopped looking for signs that the organization was still operating. Because she knew that as long as they remained active, no one's mind was truly safe from being turned into just another asset in someone else's collection. And sometimes, late at night, she wondered how many of the people around her, colleagues, friends, family members, might already be operating under programming they didn't even know existed.